Section 33 of The Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine H. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins. Section 33. Catherine of Russia, Part 2. Here he wrote a letter to the Empress, promising submission and acknowledging his misconduct. She deigned him no answer, but with her army approached his palace. At first he ordered a horse, intending to fly to the frontiers of Poland, but, always irresolute, he changed his plan and directed his fortress to be dismantled and his Holstein guard to retire to a distance, that Catherine might be touched by his entire surrender. She caused him to be seized, however, and placed in close confinement till he wrote and signed a declaration that he was not capable of reigning, and that he voluntarily abdicated the throne. Even this did not serve to secure his liberty. The same night he was conducted by a strong guard to Ropecca, a small imperial palace about 14 miles from Petersburg. In despair at his sad prospects of imprisonment, he sent a message to Catherine, entreating her to send an old Negro buffoon who had often amused him, a favorite dog, his violin, a Bible, and a few romances. She maintained a scornful silence. Catherine had been crowned empress. She had published a manifesto, declaring her motives to have been a tender love for her people, and anxiety for the preservation of the holy Greek religion. She had used every means to beguile and deceive the troops who were necessary to her success, but she still felt insecure. She was alarmed at the murmurings and resistance of various distant towns and cities, which would have declared for Peter III had he succeeded in presenting himself before them. A career of guilt, once commenced, leads to manifold crimes. Probably Catherine, in her first design of seizing the throne, had no thought of imbruing her hands in the blood of those who, as descendants of Peter the Great, and rightful heirs to the throne, were revered in the eyes of the people. Harassed by constant fears of insurrection, and unwilling to resign what she had so dexterously grasped, she listened to the whispered suggestions of the fiendish courtiers who had thus far assisted her, and connived at, or at least did not prevent, the assassination of Peter III in order to remove one so obnoxious to her repose. This act was accomplished with such secrecy and deception that the emperor's disappearance long remained a mystery, though no one hesitated to cast suspicion on Catherine. The revolting details have since been revealed. Alexei Orloff, noted for his strength and brutality, undertook with 2 companions the execution of the deed. 7 days after the empress had been crowned, which occurred June 28, 1762, Alexei repaired to the palace where Peter was confined, and, as he had often done before, dined with the emperor. Lieutenant Passek, who was present, assisted him in introducing poison into the wine poured out for Peter. The unsuspecting emperor drank freely, and presently was seized with violent pain. Recognizing the design, he called for milk to allay his sufferings, and mingling his cries of agony with reproaches. They again pressed him to swallow more of the fatal beverage, but he resisted with all his strength. His valet, hearing the noise, rushed in. Peter threw himself in his arms, exclaiming faintly, "It was not enough to deprive me of the throne of Russia. I must now be murdered." The valet attempted to defend him, but Orloff, with his giant strength, easily thrust him from the room, and returned to his victim. The emperor fought with the strength of despair, but after a fierce and terrible struggle, he was thrown to the floor, and strangled with a napkin snatched from the dinner table. Alexei Orloff immediately mounted his horse and rode at full speed to Petersburg to inform the empress. On his arrival, he found her just going to make her appearance at court. She maintained her composure ease, and usual gaiety, dined in public, and in the evening again held a court. The following day, while she was dining with the foreign ministers and a few courtiers, a messenger was ushered in with great ceremony, and announced the tidings of the emperor's death. Catherine immediately arose from table, and with her handkerchief at her eyes, hastened to shut herself in her own apartments, where she remained for several days, as if overwhelmed with sorrow. During that time, she caused a manifesto to be published, which, after mentioning his illness, declared that, in obedience to the divine command by which we are enjoined to preserve the life of our neighbor, we ordered that Peter should be furnished with everything that might be judged necessary to restore his health. It also expressed her great affliction, but despite this fabric of falsehoods, and Catherine's artful assumption of grief, no one was so stupid as to believe what she asserted, though no one dared say a word upon the matter, and that was all the Empress wished. The remains of Peter were brought to the capital and buried with great pomp. Her next movement was to send Ivan back to prison, and at the same time she gave orders to put him to death if any attempt was made to deliver him. There were many who sympathized with the unfortunate prince, fated to spend a lifetime, from infancy to manhood, in dungeons and fortresses, where he was subjected to every manner of suffering. Ivan is described as having fine light hair, regular features, an extremely fair complexion, a figure of commanding height and fine proportions, and a voice sweet and touchingly mournful in its accents. A conspiracy was set on foot to rescue him and place him upon the throne, headed by an officer named Mirovich, who forced his way into the fortress of Schlüsselburg, where Ivan was confined, determined to deliver him. The guards immediately assassinated the defenseless prince and flung his body before Mirovich, who immediately threw down his sword and surrendered. All who were engaged in this conspiracy were imprisoned, knouted, or sent to Siberia. Catherine, now relieved of those who could cause her the most uneasiness, turned her attention to measures which would secure the applause of her subjects and give her the fame she was ambitious to gain abroad. She no longer needed the services of the Princess Dashkoff, who had become odious to her, notwithstanding her sacrifices of family and of herself in the cause of her friend. Catherine was not capable of friendship. She made tools of those whom she flattered with her confidence. Princess Dashkoff, in the beginning of the Revolution, had put on the uniform of the Guards, and now asked, as a recompense for her services, the title of colonel of a regiment. To this the Empress scornfully replied that the academy would suit her better than a military corps. The princess resented her ingratitude, and spoke of it among her friends, with the bold independence natural to her. But for such imprudence she was ordered to retire to Moscow. The Archbishop of Novgorod, who had also materially assisted in Catherine's designs, was disappointed in his expected reward, and dismissed with a warning as to how he vented his rage. These and similar occurrences caused discontent and irritation among the people, which took so serious a turn that it was thought for a time Catherine would be hurled from the throne she had usurped. But her courage and presence of mind never forsook her. She inflicted such terrible punishments upon the ringleaders as effectively prevented any farther demonstrations of dissatisfaction. Among the first acts of her reign was the confirmation of the two principal edicts of her predecessor, which had given him such popularity at his accession. But she took good care to appropriate all the credit to herself. With a policy that consulted the low state of the finances, she also ratified the treaties that had been made with Denmark and Prussia. By thus securing peace, she was enabled to turn her attention to the improvement and aggrandizement of Russia. She instituted many wise and admirable regulations that secured the highest encomiums from other nations, though it is said she was undeserving her celebrity as a lawgiver, since her famous code consisted of a tissue of paragraphs taken principally from Montesquieu's Esprit de Loi and Beccaria's Treatise on Crime and Punishment, and other well-known writers. She laid claim to her code as having originated it herself, and complacently received the adulations of all Europe. She certainly deserves credit, however, for her energy and skill in devising and prosecuting arrangements for the founding of colleges and hospitals on a grand scale in the principal cities, for the establishment of a foundling and lying-in hospital under the most benevolent and salutary regulations, and for the magnificent seminaries she endowed at Petersburg, one for the education of 500 young ladies, the other a military school for young men, both of which are still the pride of Petersburg. She also invited foreigners from every country, whether professional or scientific men, artisans, mechanics, or common laborers, an invitation which quickly populated the deserts of Russia with a host who loudly murmured their discontent after they arrived and regretted their foolishness in abandoning better homes. All this and more was accomplished in the first year and a half of Catherine's reign. She added to her own reputation abroad for sagacity and wisdom by assisting at all the deliberations of the councils, read the dispatches from her ambassadors, dictated or wrote the answers, and attended to all the minutiae of foreign affairs. She often had interviews with Munich, who suggested to her the plan of driving the Turks from Constantinople, and with Bestucheff, a man of profound policy, who had the experience of Grand Chancellor in Elizabeth's reign, and who kept Catherine informed of the politics and resources of the European courts. In her interviews with foreign ministers, she assured them of her independence and courage, told them the world must not judge of her yet, that she had scarcely begun her reign, and would surprise Europe in time with her great exploits, and assured them she should behave with the princes of other nations like a finished coquette. But in the midst of all her occupations, the Empress did not forget her old favorites, or neglect to find new ones. In this she imitated the profligate example of Elizabeth. Gregory Orloff, brother of Alexei, she seemed to entertain a sincere affection for, although he did not unite polished manners with beauty of person. He was ambitious, and hoped the Empress would give him her hand, and thus elevate him to the dignity of a sovereign. Catherine would only consent to a concealed marriage, but that was not sufficient for the haughty but low-born Gregory. Fearful she would degrade her rank by marrying a man whom everyone detested, her turbulent subjects concocted new conspiracies. While on a visit to Moscow, Catherine discovered one of these plots, and, alarmed for her safety, returned immediately to Petersburg, entering that city with a pompous and magnificent display, which she intended should awe the disaffected. She believed that the Princess Dashkoff influenced some of these intrigues, and determined to conceal the dislike she bore her, and invited her to court again. She wrote a flattering and deceitful letter, asking her knowledge of the conspiracies, which was not calculated, however, to blind the quick-witted princess, who had too much occasion to know Catherine's artfulness to trust her words. To the long and affectionate letter of the Empress, the wounded friend replied with daring haughtiness in a few words. "Madam," wrote she, "I have heard nothing, but if I had heard anything, I should take good care how I spoke of it. What is it you require of me? That I should expire on a scaffold? I am ready to mount it." Catherine was chagrined at this display of spirit, but did not take revenge, and left the princess in disgrace to travel about Europe. She everywhere attracted attention by her singular and bold manners. After her anger towards the Empress had subsided, she returned to Russia, and Catherine, thinking it best to conciliate one so cognizant of her crimes, appointed her president of the Academy. Here she presided with the whims and temper of a virago, deprived the professors of fuel in winter from avaricious motives, and commanded them as she would have done a regiment of soldiers. Wrapped in rich furs, she seated herself in the midst of the shivering professors, dictating to them what they knew better than she, till they were tempted to abandon the country where the Empress was content to have but the shell of science and literature, without the kernel. Renown was Catherine's sole aim. For that, she continued to endow colleges and academies of science and art, which often proceeded no further than the selection of a site, or, if they were built, rarely afforded anything besides opportunities for grand and bombastic speeches from the Empress. She encouraged the arts, inviting artists to her court, and paid most extravagant prices for pictures, though without the least taste to judge of their merits or defects. Her end was accomplished, however, so long as the recipients of her generous encouragement sounded her fame. Many of the pictures decorated the walls of her palace, being fitted together without frames, so as to cover on each side the whole of the walls, without the slightest attention to disposition or general effect. When a place could not conveniently be filled, the pictures were cut to suit the vacancy. Catherine prided herself upon the generosity of her gifts to those who visited her court, and to those who performed important services. She maintained a magnificence in her movements and decorations that exceeded all the courts of Europe, and added to the glory of her achievements by founding cities as well as colleges, which those who visited her vainly looked for. Many of them were never to be found, for the very good reason that she was satisfied to designate a site, give a name, and see it swell the list of her boasted cities, though it after all existed only in her imagination. Joseph II once accompanied her to lay the foundations of a new city. On his return, he dryly remarked, "The Empress and I have this day achieved a great work. She has laid the first stone of a great city, and I have laid the last." He was just in his surmise. The city can nowhere be found except upon some of the maps of Russia. While thus engaged at home, she did not neglect to increase her power abroad. Poland, for many years, had gradually extended its possessions by the intermarriage of Polish princesses with the heirs of royal domains in Russia. Catherine, therefore, in a measure ruled the election of kings in that republic. Upon the death of Augustus III, she contrived, partly by the force of arms and partly by cunning policy, to secure the election of one of her old favorites, Count Poniatowski, a man who is described as having but small capacity to govern, rather weak than gentle, possessing a mind that was better calculated to shine in social intercourse than to sway men of cultivation. Tall, well-made, of a figure at once commanding and agreeable, he could more skillfully play the lover than the courtier. He was rather forced upon than accepted by the Poles, who loudly murmured at the accession of one who was neither distinguished by birth nor any brilliant achievements. Soon after his election, difficulties commenced in Poland which, by causing innumerable divisions of parties, weakened and exposed it to the rapacious robbery of Russia and Prussia. In 1563, a law had been passed which granted equal rights to all religious persuasions, whether Greek, Lutheran, or Catholic. In 1763, however, the Catholics had obtained a decided superiority, and excluded from the diets all those who did not adopt their faith. This occasioned serious contention. The various parties received the name of dissidents, and applied to Russia for assistance in claiming their rights. Catherine sent an army under the command of Prince Repuin, who immediately seized the principal persons in the diet and exiled them to Siberia. The king himself, through the instigation of Orloff, was treated with great indignity. Prince Repuin commanded like a despot in Warsaw, and the Poles began to be amazed at the dangerous assistance they had sought, and beheld their country overrun with Russian soldiery from whom they had no power to extricate themselves. they could only submit to the terms the Empress chose to grant them. She already proposed the recovery of those parts of Poland which had been annexed from Russia, but her plans were not yet fully formed. She contented herself for a few years to use her domineering influence over a nation that she was in honor bound to protect and not to oppress. In 1768, Turkey declared war against Russia in consequence of the oppression of Poland. The latter, suffering all the horrors of a war partly civil, partly religious, and partly foreign, and its haughty brave nobles, unwilling to brook the outrages of Russia, applied to Turkey for relief. Catherine, with undaunted courage, accepted the challenge, prepared an army and powerful fleets, and speedily sent them against her enemies. While they gained victories along the Danube, the Pruth, and sailed triumphant on the Euxine, Catherine was occupied at home in vast preparations to attack them even in the Isles of Greece. Her dockyards were filled with workmen who busily constructed ships of war. Her cities resounded with the clang of metal, molded and shaped into death-dealing weapons by the hands of skillful artisans. Her politicians were engaged in exciting debates as to the expediency of the undertaking. Her foreign ministers and emissaries were directed to secure the non-interference of other nations and permission to enter their ports. Her fleets were manned not only by the most experienced officers of her own empire, but notable Englishmen, Danes, and Dutch were enlisted in her service. Admiral Spiridov commanded the fleet, but he and all the armies were under the orders of Alexei Orlov, who had been appointed general. While these fleets and armies were sweeping victoriously through the archipelago and harassing the borders of the Turkish Empire, Catherine, always industrious in intrigues, kept up a secret correspondence with Frederick of Prussia pertaining to Poland. They mediated the partition of that nation. An interview, however, was necessary to perfect the design. Unwilling that other monarchs should discover their infamous intentions, and knowing their motives could not be concealed if an ostentatious visit was made by either party, they decided to resort to stratagem. Prince Henry, the brother of Frederick, received instructions to go to Russia with full powers to concert the desired measures with the Empress. It was given out that he intended making a visit to his sister, Queen of Sweden, and should return to Prussia by way of Denmark. While at Stockholm, he received pressing invitations from Catherine to visit her at Petersburg, in which she expressed her anxiety to entertain so illustrious a prince. As if it had not all been managed beforehand, Henry expressed unexpected pleasure, and with an apparent change of his plans, set out for Petersburg, accompanied by a brilliant suite. He was received with flattering attentions by the minister, Count Penin, and conducted in great state to the palace prepared for him. The first day of his arrival was passed with the most ceremonious etiquette, after which a series of entertainments were given that in magnificence outdid all the courts of Europe. One of these entertainments was given at the summer palace called Tsarsko Selo. It was situated at a distance of 24 versts, or 16 miles, from Petersburg, in an open country, diversified with low, picturesque hills and forests. The road to it was lighted by more than 1,000 lamps, and every verst marked by a column of marble, jasper, or granite. All along there were views of elegant country seats and gardens, Gothic palaces with their lofty towers and turrets, Chinese temples crested upon high artificial rocks, villages built in the same style, fanciful bridges, and every other device by which the route could be made attractive and enchanting. The palace itself was immense and dazzling. Within and without were profuse gilded ornaments. Every portion of the interior was fitted up in the richest and costliest style. The extensive gardens were ornamented by artificial lakes dotted with charming wooded islands, from one of which rose a Turkish mosque, from another an elegant structure for musical performances, while from others shot up tall columns or Egyptian pyramids. Miniature towns and villages, a hermitage, superb baths and picturesque ruins completed this luxurious resort that, springing up in the midst of the bleak deserts of Russia, was the realization of a Titania's kingdom. To this magnificent and showy palace the Empress conducted Prince Henry in an immense sledge, followed by 2,000 others containing a great number of ladies and the nobility, all in masks and fancy dresses. The ornaments along the road consisted of some novel display at every verst. Fireworks in every possible variety and unimagined beauty, houses built to represent the style of different nations and enlivened with people dressed in corresponding costumes, shepherds and shepherdesses exhibiting national dances, and, at a little distance from the palace, an artificial volcano representing an eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The festivities at the palace were equally ingenious and startling. At table, everything was arranged with such magician-like effect that when one wished to change his plate, he had but to tap the center, and it fell through the table and floor, and was immediately replaced by another that came up by the same means, replenished with whatever he desired. End of section 33. Section 34 of The Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine H. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins. Section 34. Catherine of Russia, Part 3. By such displays, Catherine sought to amuse her royal guest, and blind her subjects and the world at large, as to the secret purpose which all this show successfully masked. Henry looked on without appearing to be in the least diverted. He maintained a sober and dignified bearing, looking on the frivolous and expensive sports as mere child's play, but covered his disdain under an air of abstracted indifference. His dress and appearance occasioned infinite amusement to the Russians. His hair was worn in a high toupee, and his apparel sometimes consisted of a light blue frock with silver frogs, a red waistcoat, and blue breeches. In his interviews with Catherine, their disguised intentions were cautiously discussed. They decided upon the dismemberment of Poland, and Henry went so far as to assign to Austria, Turkey, Prussia, and Russia the spoils which should fall to the share of each. Catherine promised to frighten Turkey and flatter England into acquiescence. Said she, "Do you take upon you to buy over Austria, that she may amuse France?" Thus did this unscrupulous monarch devise and carry out a robbery, with as hypocritical and innocent a face as had carried her through the connived assassination of her husband. The treaty, however, was not signed for some years. Soon after Henry's departure, early in 1771, Count Alexei Orloff returned from his victories, laden with triumphant laurels, which fixed upon him the eyes of all Russia. He received honors and titles from his sovereign, and in the succeeding festivities resigned his giant strength to the ease and repose of courtly luxury. His ferocity, cruelty, and coarseness of manner were better fitted for the horrors of war than the refinement and etiquette of court. His huge arm knew better how to strike the assassin's blow than to shield the unfortunate. His soul was in its most grateful element when reveling in the consciousness of a victim's torment. At his request, Catherine provided him with ample means to prosecute his conquests in the archipelago. He left Petersburg, loaded with assurances of the favor of the Empress, and went to join the squadron prepared for him at Leghorn. While in Italy, he executed a commission from the Empress, requiring 2 pictures to be painted in representation of the burning of the Turkish fleet in the previous expedition. Orloff did not hesitate to have a score of ships in the harbor set on fire or blown up, in order that the painter might do justice to his subject. He had another commission from Catherine, which he performed with equal villainy. She had reason to fear the entire downfall of her throne as long as any descendants of Peter the Great existed. One remained, upon whom her eye was fixed. With her usual secrecy and false-heartedness, she laid a snare for the fair and unsuspecting girl whose shadow was a hateful ghost in the pathway of the guilty empress. The Empress Elizabeth, by a clandestine marriage with Razumovsky, had 3 children, the youngest a girl, named Princess Tarakanov, and protected by the Polish Prince Radziwill. He conveyed her to Rome, where she had been educated and kept in seclusion under the care of a watchful governess. Alexey Orloff succeeded in ferreting out her concealment, and by the most devoted attention and deceitful representations, won the affections of the princess and obtained her consent to a marriage. The ceremony was performed by villains in the disguise of priests. The innocent and confiding Tarakanov, believing him to be her veritable husband, accompanied him to Pisa, where a sumptuous palace was prepared for her reception. He was constantly at her side, in order to prevent anyone from instilling suspicion into her mind. She accepted his attentions as proof of his affection, and returned it with a fond tenderness that with her youth and beauty would have swerved any heart but his from its cruel purpose. Several days passed in festivities, when the princess asked to see the Russian fleet that was soon to convey away the count. He was delighted to gratify her, and accordingly she was escorted to a boat prepared with magnificent awnings to receive her, and accompanied by a suite of ladies and several Russian officers, put off from the shore in the midst of enthusiastic shouts and lively strains of music. Arrived at one of the principal ships, a splendid chair was lowered that she might, without inconvenience, be conveyed on board. Amused with the novelty, she stepped gaily on deck, but was immediately seized and handcuffed. Tears and entreaties were unavailing. In vain she supplicated at the feet of her betrayer. She was torn away and carried a prisoner down into the hold, and the following day conveyed to Russia. Catherine gave secret orders to confine her in the fortress of Petersburg, and it was afterwards surmised that she was drowned in her dungeons by the rising of the waters of the river that rolled at the foot of the tower walls. But her fate remained one of the whispered mysteries of the Russian court. In 1771, an event occurred which took the Russians by surprise, and cast an odium upon Catherine's administration that nothing could efface. The inhabitants of a province lying on the Volga, north of Astrakhan, were driven to desperation by the cruelty and injustice of the governor placed over them. They were a peaceful, hospitable people, originally from Chinese Tartary, and until within a few years had preserved their independence. Their religion and customs continued unchanged. They roamed about the steppes with their usual aversion to permanent dwellings, and also from the necessity of furnishing herbage for their hordes of cattle. Much oppression from the emissaries of the Empress, and an unheard-of indignity offered to a venerable old man, greatly beloved by his tribe, so incensed them that they resolved to abandon the Russian dominions and return to their ancient possessions at the foot of the mountains of Tibet. A report was also circulated among them that a revered Kalmuk priest, who died 3 years before, had sent them a message in the name of their gods to take possession of their ancient territories. They obeyed, and in a well-ordered march went secretly and silently on their perilous journey, an immense troop, with their wives, children, and servants, hordes of cattle, goods of every description, tents, and household utensils. So noiseless had been their departure that no intimation of it whatever reached Petersburg till they had gained 2 days' march. Catherine immediately sent troops to arrest the fugitives, but they searched in vain through the bleak deserts, till, suffering from thirst and hunger in these unwatered, barren, and depopulated regions, they were obliged to abandon the unavailing pursuit. The Chinese emperor received and protected his children, and when the exasperated empress demanded him to deliver up her runaway subjects, he scornfully refused to comply, and daringly commented on her tyranny. This Catherine never could forgive. She was used to conciliatory language from all the nations of Europe, and this bold defiance, and the dictatorial tone he used on several occasions, inspired her with a hatred that would not permit China to be favorably mentioned in her presence. Upon her application for a renewal of the treaty regarding commerce between the two nations, he provokingly replied to her envoys, "Let your mistress learn to keep old treaties, and then it will be time enough to apply for new ones." Catherine could only dissemble her mortification and anger. She had not the means to punish him for his audacity, whatever were her inclinations. The war with Turkey, her policy in regard to Poland, and the equipment of extensive fleets had exhausted her treasury. Peace, however, was declared in 1774, which ceded to Catherine several provinces, and gave her vessels the free navigation of the Black Sea and the archipelago. This opened an immense source of commerce and wealth to her empire. Marshal Romanzoff, her greatest general, received the glory of the triumphs on the borders of Turkey, and Alexei Orloff was showered with honors for his victories in the archipelago, though the credit given the latter was entirely due to the skill of the English admirals Elphinstone, Grieg, and Dugdale. While all these events were progressing, Catherine was employed at home in improving and enriching her cities and public works. Canals connecting the several rivers in and near Petersburg were embanked with granite. Sumptuous bridges were thrown across them. Magnificent palaces were built, and public offices sprang up without number, while close beside them were squalid hovels with the most wretched occupants, and in front ran streets filled with mire and dirt. Catherine, in her palace, was the same intriguing, deceitful woman she had been in the beginning of her reign. Profligate, fitful, and tyrannical, she changed her favorites as readily as her mask, lavishing the most costly gifts upon them at one moment, and the next moment sending them into exile. She seemed to retain an affection for Gregory Orloff. She created him a prince, but Count Panin, her minister and governor of the Grand Duke Paul Petrovitch, constantly employed his influence against the complete ascendancy of Orloff. Count Panin occupied the most important posts in the empire and continued to retain them until his death. His prosperity was probably owing more to Catherine's reliance upon his integrity than any brilliant talents she may have imagined him to possess. The admission of a new favorite, Potemkin, who gained complete rule over Catherine, drove both Panin and Orloff to despair. Count Panin absented himself from court, and, it is said, died from chagrin and grief at the loss of his influence. Gregory Orloff died in the same year, 1783, at Moscow, in a state of frightful insanity. The loss of a young and beautiful wife, whom he regarded with the tenderest love, occasioned a melancholy that was deeply aggravated by the loss of the Empress' favor. His last days were spent in the ravings of delirium. He imagined that the ghost of Peter III was continually pursuing him with avenging darts. Thus, Catherine was relieved from the presence of two men who had assisted in elevating her to the throne, and whose dangerous possession of her secrets gave them a fearful hold over her that she was glad to shake off. Paul Petrovitch was Panin's most sincere mourner. He really loved his preceptor, and with the greater strength because his affections were driven from every object upon which he would have centered them by his tyrannical mother. She kept him under continual surveillance, and concealed him from the public eye as completely as possible, fearful of the affection entertained for him by the people, and dreading a revolution which might place him upon his rightful throne. Although arrived at manhood, He was never allowed to enter the army or even to visit a fleet. His travels were limited, his movements closely watched and strictly reported, and Catherine always provided him with an escort of her own choosing. She condescended to select him a wife, but took good care to find one who would be too simple to engage in intrigues. He was married to a daughter of the Landgrave of Hesse-Darmstadt. As was the custom, she adopted the Greek religion and received the name of Natalia Alexierna. The Empress had reason afterwards to suspect her of engaging in political plots, and her death, which occurred a year or two after she became Grand Duchess, cast another dark imputation upon Catherine. She was scarcely cold in her grave before the Empress selected a new spouse for her son. A niece of the King of Prussia became the consort of the Grand Duke, under the name of Maria Feodorovna, and with him ascended the throne 20 years afterwards. As the kings and princes of various nations had successively visited the court of Petersburg, Catherine thought she could no longer deny a return of these distinctions in permitting the Grand Duke and his bride to visit some of the courts of Europe. She confided them to the care of one of her sworn creatures, and had dispatches daily brought her by a courier, giving a minute account of everything that transpired. While at Paris, the people were more struck with Paul's excessive ugliness than anything else. One day at the Tuileries, Louis XVI asked him if he had any person in his suite who was particularly attached to him. Paul replied, with a significance which was understood by the courtiers, "If my mother thought that I had but a dog belonging to me that loved me, tomorrow it would be flung into the Seine with a stone around its neck." He was just feeling the bitterness of having a friend exiled to Siberia for life for the offense of writing to him on account of the transactions at Petersburg during his absence. It was truly a magnanimous trait in Catherine that she permitted her son to exist at all. Orloff and Panin were entirely forgotten in the brilliant reign of the favorite who had supplanted them. Potemkin was a most extraordinary man, and it was his caprices, his intense imagination, that was forever devising some unheard-of scheme, and his audacity, that secured the ascendancy he obtained over Catherine as her favorite, her confidant, and her minister. The most opposite qualities were united in him. At one moment he was generous, at another avaricious, active yet indolent, timid and bold, condescending and haughty, politic and indiscreet, unread yet able to astonish a scholar, an artist, artisan, or divine in conversation, promising everything but rarely performing, always chasing after some gigantic plan which he spurned in disgust when attained. Altogether, he was a freak of nature, and embodied all the good and bad qualities of man, without reason or conscience to guide him. At one moment he announced his intention of becoming King of Poland, and at the next threatened to turn monk. One day he would call all the principal officers to his presence and talk of war. The next, begin a series of magnificent entertainments without the least cause. He would throw all the cabinets of Europe in a ferment by his purpose of partitioning some empire, and laugh at them at his leisure, while indolently reclining among a company of ladies. Distinguished officers attended him in the capacity of servants, and he would not hesitate to dispatch one of them more than 1,000 miles for a certain kind of soup that could only be made at Petersburg. Think of an officer riding 1,300 miles at the speed of life and death to bear a tureen of soup to his master. It was these imperious whims, his energetic will, and defiance of every obstruction to what he took it in his head to accomplish, that secured Catherine's favor. She trusted her armies to his generalship, but her historian significantly suggests, it is not to be inferred from thence that all went on well, but all went on, and the Empress desired nothing more. It was in compliance with his persuasions that Catherine was induced to visit Crimea and the other provinces that had been ceded to Russia in the treaty with the Turkish emperor. In the beginning of 1787, she left Petersburg in grand state, accompanied by all the ladies of her suite, her favorite aide-de-camp Momanoff, the French and Austrian ambassadors, all enveloped in costly furs and seated in spacious sledges, by which they were conveyed with lightning rapidity over the ice and snow. Immense fires, kindled along the roads, created artificial day. At every post was an ample relay of fresh horses, and when requiring repose, they stopped at palaces built for the occasion, which equaled those at Petersburg in splendor. Here the Empress held entertainments and feasted her flatterers, while, without, poor peasants were assembled to gaze in silent wonder upon the magic structure, shivering and pinched in the icy air, the white frost covering their shaggy heads and unshaven beards. Joseph II of Austria joined the stately cavalcade. At Kaniev, Stanislaus Augustus, King of Poland, and distinguished Polish nobles swelled the royal train. Catherine had not met her old lover for 23 years, and for once her imperturbable countenance betrayed agitation. Poniatowski, however, retained his composure, and did homage to the Empress for the crown she had bestowed upon him with as little emotion as if they had been strangers. This royal cortege sailed down the Dnieper in a fleet of 50 galleys. Potemkin had spared no expense and no device by which to astonish and impress the beholders with the state of the countries through which they passed. He dressed up shepherds and shepherdesses to attend choice flocks along the banks of the river. Palaces and whole villages were erected to give life to the scenery. Peasants were handsomely attired, troops were newly equipped, Tartars were clothed and disciplined, wildernesses were converted into blooming gardens. Everything that human ingenuity could invent had been gathered here to make the sterile deserts and the wide tracts that had been laid waste in the rapacious wars assume the appearance of populous, thriving provinces. The people, furnished with holiday dresses and engaged with music and dancing, were made to appear gay, happy, and contented, while those very regions were desolate and groaning with famine and oppression. It was an apt illustration of her whole reign, a dazzling display, which she flattered herself would blind posterity to her hideous defects, empty and heartless, like everything that emanated from her or her minions. 6 months were occupied in this unexampled tour, which resulted in nothing but a renewal of war with the Turks. Hostilities commenced near the close of the same year, 1787, and were encouraged by Prince Potemkin, who, though he seemed to have every possible desire granted, lacked one thing more to give him the happiness he was always in pursuit of, yet never found. He had never received the Order of St. George. This could not be obtained till he had commanded an army and gained victory. Thousands of human beings were thrown into the scale with a riband and star. Potemkin must be gratified with the possession of the toy. End of section 34. Section 35 of The Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine H. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins. Section 35. Catherine of Russia, Part 4. An army of 150,000 men, under the command of the celebrated generals Romanzov, Repnin, and Suvorov, commenced hostilities against the Ottoman Empire, and, during 2 years, passed from city to city, reducing them to ashes, and inhumanly massacring the inhabitants of whatever age or sex. The fierce Potemkin spared nothing. The lives of his troops were of no account. He simply gave orders from his sumptuous tents, and if everything was not gained that he commanded, he was ready to press his iron heel upon the necks of his own soldiers. Catherine, equally insensible to the rapine, bloodshed, and horrors of war, gave balls and tournaments at her capital, distributed costly gifts among the conquerors, and gave thanks in the churches for their bloody victories. In 1790, Potemkin sat with his armies before Ismail. 7 months passed, at the end of which the besieged still firmly and bravely held out. Potemkin, impatient at the long resistance, ordered it to be taken in 3 days. Suvorov obeyed, and addressing his men with the brutal words, "My brothers, no quarter. Provisions are dear," he began the assault. The Russians were twice repulsed, which added to their ferocity when they afterwards succeeded in scaling the ramparts and gained possession of the city. All the inhabitants were slain, till blood ran in torrents through the streets. Suvorov immediately wrote to the Empress with only these words, "The haughty Ismail is at your feet." Potemkin hastened to Petersburg to gain a reward for victories he no more had gained than those for which Alexei Orlov had been enriched. Catherine, however, rewarded him with the coveted riband and star, and bestowed upon him a magnificent palace and a coat laced with diamonds. All he desired was now attained, but instead of the happiness he expected to attain, he found himself the most miserable of men. Suvorov and the accompanying generals proudly laid their laurels at the feet of the Empress, who smiled upon them and bestowed estates and glittering jewels on the heroes, as if they were not all bathed in the blood of oppressed victims. This war had cost the lives of more than 600,000 men, the destruction of many cities, and the exhaustion of the Russian treasury, while nothing permanent had been gained by either nation. A treaty was soon concluded, but Potemkin did not live to see it accomplished. In the midst of his pleasures and his vices, he was suddenly seized with dangerous illness, and with his usual waywardness refused the advice of physicians and set out upon a journey. While traveling between Yassy and Nikolsev, he was too ill to proceed, and being taken out of his carriage, was laid upon the grass under a tree, where he quickly expired. Not far from the spot rested the remains of the good Howard. As if, says Dr. Clarke, the hand of destiny had directed 2 persons, in whom were exemplified the extremes of virtue and vice, to one common spot, in order that the contrast might remain a lesson for mankind. In 1792, Catherine declared war against Poland, to which she assigned various petty pretexts, while in reality it was the result of her own long-meditated division of that country. Her new favorites and ministers gladly acquiesced in a measure that promised them a large share in the rich spoils of the unhappy Poles. Frederick of Prussia, acting in concert with the Empress, dispatched an army to unite with the Russian legions, and together they overran the plains of Poland. At Warsaw, the Diet had received the declaration of war with stern calmness, succeeded by a burst of enthusiasm excited by a patriotic determination to free themselves from the Russian yoke, defend their homes, and save their nation from oblivion. An army was hastily summoned and placed under the command of Joseph Poniatowski, a man ill-fitted for such a responsible post. Nothing but disasters accompanied his efforts. The Russians were everywhere triumphant. The defenders of Poland were dispersed, their estates confiscated, and their families reduced to penury and servitude. While Poland thus lay bleeding and panting at the feet of the conquerors, Kosciuszko, whose name is dear to the lovers of liberty, sprang up from the despairing hosts, girded on the warrior's armor, and with the glorious resolve of rescuing his countrymen and his nation from the haughty victors, gathered about him the few bold spirits who dared to offer themselves as a shield to Poland. Peasants, whom he caused to be freed from servitude, augmented his little army. He was chosen their general. Inspired with the patriotic fire of the brave leader, the enthusiastic army swept all before them. Had their king and his partisans united with their efforts, Poland might still have had a place among nations. But the dissensions that, since the accession of Stanislaus Augustus, had rendered united action impossible, occasioned the final triumph of Russia and Prussia. Catherine had sent fresh troops, and Frederick stationed himself at the head of his own forces during the last engagement. The Poles were overpowered, the army cut to pieces, and the brave Kosciuszko fell wounded and senseless in the thickest of the battle. He was carried a prisoner to Petersburg, confined in a dungeon till the death of Catherine, and then brought forth by Paul and loaded with honors. The emperor offered him employment in the Russian service, which he declined. It is said that Paul presented him with his own sword in admiration for the noble Pole, but Kosciuszko replied, "I no longer need a sword, since I no longer have a country." His soul glowed with the love of liberty. Melancholy and oppressed at the sight of Poland in chains, he sought the shores of young America, and generously devoted his noble and exalted powers to her cause. He was too pure a jewel for a Russian setting. Leaving his revered name associated with the loved Washington and Lafayette in the struggle for American liberty, he repaired to Switzerland, where he died in 1817. The Poles, just awakened to his inestimable worth, conveyed his remains to his native land, and almost divine honors were paid to his memory. To return to the events of 1794, Catherine displaced Stanislaus Augustus, who had not been adroit enough to secure the confidence of either party. She sent him to Grodno, condemned to live obscurely on a pension granted by her, and created Prince Repnin governor of the provinces that fell to her share in the infamous division of Poland. The following year, the Empress added another rich province to her empire. Courland, by her intricate and unscrupulous stratagems, was secured without having recourse to arms, and those who resisted her usurpations were immediately deprived of their estates and sent to Siberia. The remainder were frightened into submission. The death of Frederick of Prussia deprived her of an assistant in her plots, and gave her an enemy in his successor. She threatened him with war. At the same time, she turned her covetous eyes upon Persia, designing its scepter for Alexander, one of her grandsons. For Constantine, another of Paul's sons, she intended to extend her conquests in Turkey and set him upon the Ottoman throne. Sweden she determined should fall to Alexandrina, her favorite and beautiful granddaughter. This princess is described as just 15, tall, well-formed, with noble and regular features, a profusion of fine hair, and eyes that beamed with intelligence and sensibility. In person, mind, and manners, Alexandrina was one of the most lovely and accomplished princesses in Europe. Catherine set her heart upon making her Queen of Sweden. To accomplish it, she succeeded in prevailing upon Gustavus Adolphus, the young king of Sweden, to visit her court. He repaired to Petersburg, accompanied by the regent, his ministers, and a brilliant suite, an arrival that occasioned a gorgeous display on the part of Catherine. Gustavus Adolphus was nearly 18, of elegant stature, agreeable face, free and graceful manners that were calculated to captivate a free heart. At their presentation, Gustavus and Alexandrina were equally won by the unexpected beauty and grace of the other. The charms of the Russian belle overcame his affection for the Princess of Mecklenburg, to whom he was affianced. The engagement was easily broken off, and the fascinating king was soon the accepted suitor of the happy Alexandrina. Articles of marriage were drawn up, the day for the betrothment appointed, and splendid preparations for its celebration occupied all the court. The day arrived, and Catherine, with her officers and attendants, occupied the presence chamber in a style that equaled, if not outvied, Oriental magnificence. The Swedish suite, in brilliant court dresses, waited upon their king, and the brilliant circle was completed by the manly presence of the royal groom and the lovely bride, bewitchingly veiled in a mist of costly lace. The Chancellor Markoff commenced reading the contract, when, to the surprise of the imperial family, Gustavus interrupted him, and observed that the laws of Sweden required that the princess should change her religion, without which agreement he could not sign the contract. The Empress remonstrated, flattered, almost entreated, but the young king was immovable. Not willing to sacrifice her dignity to farther efforts, she coldly arose, and with unaltered countenance, majestically moved out of the apartment, followed by the pale bride and all her attendants. Nothing more was said upon the matter. The following day, the Swedish king and his suite quitted Petersburg. Alexandrina, who was the keenest sufferer, had been led to her apartments, when she fainted away, and afterwards gave up to a melancholy that was not diverted by her marriage with the Archduke of Austria. She fell into a decline, and died at the age of 19. The mortification and disappointment of Catherine had as fatal and a more sudden effect, because of her struggle to suppress her anger and chagrin in the presence of curious spectators. Her temper was too imperious to endure graciously such a slight. Whether it was the occasion of her death or not, she was soon after seized with a fit of apoplexy that terminated her life the 9th of November, 1796. At the height of her guilty grandeur, in the midst of premeditated injustice, her hand raised with threatened violence against unoffending nations, this wicked empress was summoned into eternity without a moment's warning. A happy death, said her subjects. Happy, perhaps, because her soul had made its exit as completely veiled as she had struggled to keep it during her life. The Grand Duke was immediately proclaimed emperor under the title of Paul I. His first duty was to direct the imposing ceremonials of the empress' interment. He directed the remains of his father, Peter III., to be disinterred and brought to Petersburg from the church of the monastery of St. Alexander Nevsky, where they had quietly reposed for more than 30 years. His coffin was placed beside that of the empress, and his crown, which the unfortunate monarch had never worn, was brought from Moscow and placed above him. Over both lay a kind of true love knot, with the inscription, "Divided in life, united in death." Paul, probably from motives of revenge, ordered Alexei Orloff, who resided at Moscow, and Beretinsky, his assistant in the murder of the deceased emperor, to stand one on each side of the corpse of Peter as chief mourners. In the state chamber of the palace, draped with sable hangings, lighted with tapers and filled with courtiers in gloomiest black, these two appointed mourners were obliged to station themselves beside their mouldered victim. Alexei Orloff was too strongly nerved to be overcome by this mode of vengeance, but Beretinsky, more sensitive, sank under the doleful task, and it was only by repeatedly applying stimulants that he could be made to keep his station during the 3 long hours of ceremonials. Count Orloff afterwards received permission to travel without asking it, which is the Russian form of dismissing or disgracing a favorite, who returns to court at the peril of breathing the icy air of Siberia. Catherine II reigned 34 years, years full of glory and shame to Russia. Few of her works remained permanently, and much of the good she accomplished was soon overturned under the short and cruel administration of Paul. She was neither loved nor hated by the Russians, So accustomed are they to tyranny that they submissively and meekly yield to whatever their sovereign chooses to enforce. Notwithstanding Catherine's severity and imperious airs, she was not a tyrant in her own palace, but free, easy, and gay. She is described as preserving her grace and majesty to the last period of her life. She was of moderate stature, but well proportioned, and as she carried her head very high, she appeared rather tall. She had an open brow, an aquiline nose, an agreeable mouth, and her chin, though long, was not misshapen. Her hair was auburn, her eyebrows black and rather thick, and her blue eyes had a gentleness which was often affected, but oftener still betrayed pride. Her physiognomy was not deficient in expression, but that expression never discovered what was passing in the soul of Catherine, or rather it served her the better to disguise it. She wore the Russian costume, that being the most becoming to her. Green was the color most in vogue with the Russians, and she usually adopted it. Her hair, slightly powdered, flowed upon her shoulders and was surmounted by a small cap covered with diamonds, which gave a coquettish finish to her costume. With a different husband and a more enlightened people, it is hard to say what her fame and fate would have been. As it was, a brazen face and ready dagger were all that she ever needed, and for her use of these alone is she to be credited in seizing and maintaining her great power. She deserves praise for encouraging the literature of her own country and for tolerating all religions. In these respects she was nobly unlike many of her compeers, but her private life was disgraced by a licentiousness that she hardly attempted to conceal, and she expended enough energy in empty and ludicrous affectations of enterprise to have made her realm prosperous and glorious in reality instead of occasional appearance. End of section 35.
Section 36 of The Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in August 2010. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins. Section 36. Marie Antoinette, Part 1. My hair is grey, but not with years, for it grew white in a single night, as men's have grown from sudden fears. Byron. The first French Revolution, like the superlative vices it both sprang from and gave birth to, was a monster of frightful mien, but it cannot be said of it, as of vice, that, seen too oft, familiar with its face, we first endure, then pity, then embrace, the revolting theme, as one congenial to any sympathies of our nature. There is such a thing as human nature, and such a thing as French nature, said a great writer, and nothing but a French temperament, that still delights in blue fire and bloody bone fiction, can often relish such a dish of horrors as the Reign of Terror. At least it must be a jaded Parisian sensualism that needs such an incentive to mental appetite. The craving for the horrible that, like the inclination to fix a fascinated gaze on the face of the dead, or to approach and leap from a precipice, is a strange attribute of mind, finds this portion of earth's history too nauseating to be many times perused. The ingredients collected by the witches of Macbeth for a charm of powerful trouble, of which the most palatable were adder's fork and blind worm's sting, lizard's leg and owlet's wing, are mere child's confectionery in the comparison. The tortures of the Hindu and of the American savage are tender mercies when contrasted with the red fool fury of the Seine. And besides the disgusting and stupefying nature of the details, they are too familiar to everyone in this reading age to make a repicturing of them pardonable. No subject has been so often rehearsed, and it is necessarily and sufficiently brought into view in the accounts of other heroines of the period, so that the events accompanying Marie Antoinette's agonies may be now dismissed with a glance. Into her cup all the blackest drops of those dreadful years seem to have been pressed. So protracted, intense, and every way sharpened were her sufferings, and so indescribable was the monster revolution that slowly crushed her in its coils, that no language can represent the reality, except it be Pollock's unequalled painting of the undying worm, a passage of poetry well worth examining in this connection. One I remarked attentively, but how shall I describe what naught resembles else my eyes hath seen? Of worm or serpent kind it something looked, but monstrous, with 1,000 snaky heads, eyed each with double oars of glaring wrath, and with as many tails that twisted out in horrid revolution, tipped with stings, and all its mouths, that wide and darkly gaped, and breathed most poisonous breath, had each a sting, forked and long and venomous and sharp, and in its writhings infinite it grasped malignantly what seemed a heart, swollen vast and quivering with torture most intense. And still the heart, with anguish throbbing high, made effort to escape, but could not, for however it turned, and oft it vainly turned, these complicated foldings held it fast, and still the monstrous beast with sting of head or tail transpierced it, bleeding evermore. Such was Marie Antoinette's high-throbbing heart, and such was the mob of Paris, an unimaginable dragon, headed by mad tribunals. No connected sketch of the life of this unfortunate queen is intended. A few scenes in that life of wonderful vicissitudes will be given. The influences that surrounded her early years may be gathered from the biography of Maria Theresa, her imperial mother, who gave birth to this daughter in the palace at Vienna, November 2nd, 1755. The day was also memorable for the great earthquake at Lisbon, which, like the terrible thunderstorm that followed Marie Antoinette's marriage, was regarded by her as an evil omen, and certainly was a fit emblem of the earthquake and storm of political revolution which buried the splendors and joys of her reign in ruin, misery, and death. Fair-haired, beautiful, and joyous, Marie grew up in the peace and freedom of her early home. She was surrounded by brothers and sisters of remarkable loveliness and promise, who were enough company for her in all the occupations or sports of childhood and youth. The imperial nursery was their kingdom, where they ruled even their governesses and preceptors, and were safe from all intrusion. Their handsome and gay father, the Emperor Francis of Austria, visited them only to mingle in their gaieties, and receive their noisy familiar caresses. Him they loved, and deeply mourned his death, as of one who was numbered in their happy band. He died when Marie, his favorite daughter, was 10 years old, and before he set out on the journey from which he never returned alive, he ordered his coachman to wait until she was called, and he had again embraced her affectionately. The young princes and princesses regarded their masculine and heroic mother with little feeling except that of distant awe. She was too much occupied with her wars and affairs of state to think much of her family. But once a week did she visit them, with much the same business spirit that she reviewed her troops or inspected her public asylums. In the same way that one glances at a morning paper, or that she inquired the foreign news of her minister, she questioned her family physician each morning in regard to the health of her children, and she only deigned to see them when a sickness was reported, or when she occasionally gathered them at her dinner table, in order to impress some ambassador with the idea that she herself superintended their education. The teachers of Marie Antoinette were more solicitous to win her favor, from interested motives, than to advance her in knowledge. As feigned proofs of her proficiency, they exhibited to the Empress the exercises in composition which they had first written in pencil for Marie to trace afterwards in ink, or sketches of drawing which she had never touched with her own hand, and they taught her Latin sentences which she did not understand, but calmly recited to visitors at court on occasions of presentation, as if she were able to converse in that language. Metastasio, her Italian instructor, was alone faithful to his charge. He was so agreeable and assiduous that she could speak and write the soft musical language of Dante and Tasso with fluent elegance. She at length gained much facility in French conversation, but through all her life she was forced to lament her deficiency in every solid acquirement. After her engagement to the Dauphin of France, 2 French actors of superficial character were employed to perfect her in elocution and singing, and when these were dismissed as incompetent, the Abbé de Vermont was sent from Paris to be her tutor. He seems to have accomplished little else than the encouraging of her naturally unrestrained, frolicsome, and capricious disposition, and the instilling into her mind a lasting and fun-loving contempt of the ceremonious French court to which she was destined. After her arrival there, no effort of hers was sufficient to subdue her uncontrollable vivacity, the teachings of the Abbé, and the fashionable freedom of manners she had learned at Vienna. Nor could she then find time or patience, notwithstanding her earnest attempts, to master the elements of history, philosophy, the English language, or even her native German, whereof she knew little, the Italian being the court speech of the Austrian capital. But what was lost in preparation for after life was gained in the careless and unchecked happiness of youth, which was almost the only unclouded sunshine of a life that gradually darkened to the deepest horrors. Unconscious of their subsequent splendid or wretched fate, she and her brothers and sisters pouted their full Austrian lips in mock vexation, or tossed their golden ringlets in mimic bravery, laughed, chattered, and romped at their will through the apartments that were their little realm, or sported among the trees, fountains, and lakes of the gardens of Schönbrunn. 15 years of life bloomed in the cheek and sparkled in the eyes of Marie when she bade a formal adieu to her dignified mother and a sad farewell to her comrades and youthful scenes. Her grief was relieved only by anticipations of the magnificence that awaited her as bride to the heir apparent of the French throne. At the borders of her adopted land, an embassy awaited to receive her, and to conduct her to the bridegroom, who was to meet her at Compiègne. Quote, "A superb pavilion," unquote, writes Madame Campan, quote, "had been prepared upon the frontiers near Kehl. It consisted of a vast saloon, connected with 2 apartments, one of which was assigned to the lords and ladies of the court of Vienna, and the other to the suite of the Dauphiness, composed of the Countess de Noailles, her lady of honor, the Duchess de Cos, her tire-woman, 4 ladies of the bedchamber, the Count de Sault-Taverne, the first gentleman usher, the Count de Tessé, first equerry, the Bishop of Chartres, chief almoner, the officers of the bodyguards, and the pages. When the Dauphiness had been entirely undressed, even to her body linen and stockings, in order that she might retain nothing belonging to a foreign court, an etiquette always observed on such an occasion, the doors were opened, the young princess came forward, looking round for the Countess de Noailles, then, rushing into her arms, she implored her, with tears in her eyes, and with a heartfelt sincerity, to direct her, to advise her, and to be in every respect her guide and support. It was impossible to refrain from admiring her aerial deportment. Her smile was sufficient to win the heart, and in this enchanting being, in whom the splendor of French gaiety shone forth, an indescribable but august serenity, perhaps also the somewhat proud position of her head and shoulders, betrayed the daughter of the Caesars." End quote. Passing thus through the central pavilion to the smaller tent occupied by her new friends, she was arrayed in the costliest robes that France could command. With a dazzling escort of nobility and soldiery, with music and the ringing of village bells, with illuminations by night and processions of flower-strewing maidens by day, the bride was hastened to the presence of the royal court, which had come to Compiègne to meet her and to accompany her to Versailles. There the wedding took place, on the 16th of May, 1770. The utmost ingenuity of the most luxurious people in their most luxurious age was exhausted in the pomp and pleasures of the occasion. The beauty and deportment of Marie Antoinette added greatly to the enthusiasm of the scene. An eyewitness declares that, quote, "The Dauphiness, then 15 years of age, beaming with freshness, appeared to all eyes more than beautiful. Her walk partook at once of the noble character of the princesses of her house and of the graces of the French. Her eyes were mild, her smile lovely." Louis XV, the reigning monarch, was enchanted with the young Dauphiness. All his conversation was about her graces, her vivacity, and the aptness of her repartees. She was yet more successful with the royal family when they beheld her shorn of the splendor of the diamonds with which she had been adorned during the earliest days of her marriage. When clothed in a light dress of taffety, she was compared to the Venus de Medicis and the Atalanta of the Marly Gardens. Poets sang her charms, painters attempted to copy her features. An ingenious idea of one of the latter was rewarded by Louis XV. The painter's fancy led him to place the portrait of Marie Antoinette in the heart of a full-blown rose. End quote. She was not indeed regular in feature, but had enough loveliness to justify such superlative praise from her contemporaries. Her figure was tall and graceful. Her movements had the ease and majesty of her mother when she excited the Hungarians to arms. Her neck was proud and swan-like. Her hair a light auburn, soft and lustrous. Her forehead high, with finely arched brows, and these, with eyes of luminous blue, full-blown lips, and good teeth, not to mention the brilliant expression which is the true charm of a countenance, more than compensated for such defects as too prominent a nose and cheekbones. Her lively wit and impulsiveness was her crowning attraction, though it occasioned her much trouble, through the misrepresentation of enemies and her unavoidable infringements of uncongenial etiquette. Her husband was her opposite in everything but kindness and sincerity. He was grandson to Louis XV, the voluptuous king who then held an oppressive sceptre. Plain in person, he was awkward, diffident, coldly unimpassioned in temperament, and devoted to retirement and books. Though afterwards a loving husband and tender father, he was, at first and for years, totally insensible to the glowing charms of his wife, never showing her a single mark of special affection, nor acting towards her in any respect as a husband. She bore this treatment with outward composure, but inward grief and indignation. It was this unaccountable absence of love on his part, and her despair at the odium that would fall upon her if she never gave an heir to the crown, that led her, uneducated as she was, to a frivolous life of amusement and extravagance, which was greatly exaggerated by the scandalous reports of her foes. And it was all this, together with a national hatred towards Austria, fomented by factions of the nobility, that led to the wreaking of popular vengeance on an innocent king and queen for the wrongs of centuries. 8 years of nominally married life passed before Marie Antoinette became a mother and gave herself to serious cares. During this long period she was equally forced and disposed to banish her private misery by every expedient of recreation. 4 years after her marriage, her husband and herself had succeeded to the throne, he being 24 years of age and she 20. When the news of the death of Louis XV was brought to them, they were overwhelmed with the sudden responsibility that had fallen on them, and, kneeling, cried, "O God, guide us, protect us, we are too young to govern." But Marie, now a queen, had still no resource but in the dissipations of royalty. For her, the palace of St. Cloud was provided at an expense of $1 million, and a yearly income of $80,000 was appropriated to her use. She had every temptation to live a butterfly life amidst all the sweets that were profusely offered to her taste, and, although she established several hospitals and made some provision for the poor in the vicinity of the gorgeous palace and grounds at Versailles, yet she yielded to the enticements of fashionable folly, willing thus to drown her threefold mortification at her ignorance, the indifference of the king, and the calumnies of her adversaries. Her mind was natively vigorous and gifted, but was suffered to run to waste. Besides St. Cloud, a small palace called the Little Trianon, within the bounds of Versailles, was given to her. It was of Roman architecture, exquisitely fitted up, and situated among sequestered gardens, in the adornment of which all the strange genius of the times had been displayed. Hither Marie often fled from the balls, operas, festivities, and tedious punctilio of the court to enjoy intervals of quiet and liberty. Arrayed in a loose white robe and straw hat, and with a switch in her hand, she tripped lightly over the fresh greensward, and among a little band of friends acted the amateur farmer's wife or dairymaid. The exterior of a thatched building was made to represent a barn, while the interior was a brilliant ballroom for select private parties. The fashions at this period manifested the spirit of the land and the age in which Marie's fortune was cast. At the commencement of her reign, the hair, full of powder and pomatum, was erected to a height that almost doubled the apparent stature of the ladies. Caricatures were published, representing hairdressers as ascending to these towers of hair by means of ladders. Hooped dresses were worn, distended like balloons. But the story of Paul and Virginia, in which the simple dress of the heroine is described, so captivated all hearts that a great revolution in dress was effected. Plain robes of white muslin and straw hats succeeded. Afterwards, as the revolution advanced, the Grecian and Roman costumes were exactly copied in honor of the ancient republics. This, however, was after the queen's imprisonment, when she was reduced to the one dress which she happened to wear at the time of her capture. As an instance of the fêtes given by the queen and the manner in which every deed of hers was misrepresented, may be quoted a description of a scene at the Petit Trianon on the occasion of a visit from her brother, the Emperor Joseph of Austria. Quote, "The art with which the English garden was lighted, not illuminated, produced a charming effect. Earthen lamps concealed by painted green boards threw a light upon the beds of shrubs and flowers, and brought out their several tints in the most varied and pleasing manner. Several hundred burning faggots in the moat behind the Temple of Love kept up a blaze of light, which rendered the spot the most brilliant in the garden. After all, the evening's entertainment was indebted to the good taste of the artists, yet it was much talked of. The uninvited courtiers were dissatisfied, and the people who never forgive any fêtes but those they share in, contributed greatly to the envious exaggerations which were circulated as to the cost of this little affair, which were so ludicrously absurd as to state that the faggots burnt in the moat required the destruction of a whole forest. The queen, being informed of these reports, was determined to know exactly how much wood had been consumed, and she found that 1,500 faggots had sufficed to keep up the fire until 4 o'clock in the morning." End quote. But neither in this case nor in any other did any contradiction of ill-natured stories serve to disabuse the public mind. The king took no part in the diversions of his consort, and this gave color to the gross charges circulated against her. He was a man of good features, yet with a melancholy look. His walk was a plodding one, his hair and dress disorderly, however neatly arranged by his attendants, and his voice was harsh and shrill. Marie would gladly have nestled herself in his affection, had he proffered it, notwithstanding his ungainly appearance and stolid manners. He gave himself much to study, was versed in history and English literature, familiar with geography, and fond of drawing and coloring maps. He had also an unaristocratic liking for mechanic arts, such as masonry and lock-making, and would employ himself with a locksmith in his private room, from which he would often come into the Queen's presence, with his hands blackened with his work. But he was a man of upright and benevolent intentions and regular habits. Whether the Queen were to attend a party or concert or not, he always retired to sleep at precisely 10 o'clock. In all church observances he was very conscientious, as also in his endeavors to reform abuses of government. And, after a few years, he gradually warmed towards his wife, so that he became at length an exemplary, tender husband and father. He was worthy of a better fate than that which awaited him. End of section 36. Section 37 of The Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in August 2010. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins. Section 37. Marie Antoinette. Part 2. Such were the King and Queen of France, on whom fell the iniquities of a long line of sovereigns. They became the parents of 4 children, 2 of whom died in infancy, leaving Maria Theresa and Louis Charles, 2 bright and beautiful children, the first of whom was 11 years old, and the last 8, when the tempest of the Revolution burst upon the royal family. This event was chiefly due to ages of wrong, to the influence of the American Revolution, and to the plotting factions of French nobles and statesmen, who inflamed the populace and brought destruction on themselves as well as their good king. But there were many incidents in the Queen's life which, perverted by busy scandal, hastened the fearful denouement. The chief of these was the famous affair of the diamond necklace. Marie was fond of jewelry. Louis XV had given her a necklace of pearls, each of which was as large as a filbert, and all remarkably alike, and the crown jewels she used, of course. She had also bracelets that cost $40,000. Bachmer, the crown jeweler, had gratified her with earrings composed of pear-shaped diamonds and worth $70,000. He now determined to outdo himself. He traveled over Europe, bought up the rarest diamonds, and made a necklace in which he expended a fortune of $320,000. This he offered to the Queen, but, to his astonishment, her taste had become more simple, and her sense of economy was too strong for the temptation. By no means could he induce her to purchase his chef-d'œuvre, in which all his hopes were at stake. Meanwhile, the Countess Lamotte, a relative yet enemy of the royal family and a dissolute woman, forged a promissory note in the Queen's name for the amount of the necklace, and palmed off the deception on Cardinal de Rohan, who thus procured the jewels for the Countess. She disposed of them in some way, and began to live in a style of great extravagance. The sovereigns believed the cardinal to be an accomplice in the fraud. He and the Countess were tried. He was acquitted, and doubtless to show an indignity to her royal blood, she was sentenced by the tribunal to be whipped, branded, and imprisoned for life. Afterwards she perished tragically in London. But it was industriously reported that the queen was privy to the whole plot against the jeweller, and the dark suspicion exasperated many against Marie Antoinette. Besides this, from her first entrance into France, innumerable tales were spread to her prejudice. From the hour of her marriage, Madame du Barry, the transcendently fascinating courtesan of Louis XV, jealous of the influence of the fair young Austrian, did all in her power to injure her. The old formal dowagers, in their hoop dresses and black caps, who waited on the Dauphiness, were shocked at her youthful improprieties and became her implacable enemies, their spite being specially increased by the irrepressible smiles of Marie when, on state occasions, her friend, a roguish young marchioness, made sport of the solemn ladies by playing pranks behind their backs. The Austrians' girlish mirthfulness and nonconformity to the absurd etiquette of the court was improved to the utmost by all lovers of form or haters of Austrian supremacy. After she assumed the crown, she abolished the custom of admitting the people to see the royal family dine, a moving crowd having always been permitted to enter the palace and gaze at their sovereigns at table from behind the railing, as if it were a show of feeding wild animals. The denial of this privilege was a grudge against the queen. Her want of education likewise exposed her to the animadversions of the intellectual society of Paris, and this was heightened by her natural choice of not the best informed ladies for her favorites. Her villa of Little Trianon was falsely said to have been named by her Little Vienna, while it was reported that she hated France and sighed for her native land. She once brought home a peasant child who had been run over by her carriage. This child was actually declared to be an illegitimate son of her own, whom she had introduced into the palace by such an expedient. At another time her royal chariot broke down on the way to the opera, obliging her to take a hackney coach. This was maliciously construed into an apology for some nightly assignation. So also, at a levee, she expressed admiration for a heron's plume worn by the unprincipled Duke de Lauzun. He gallantly presented it to her, and she, not to offend him, once appeared with it in public, enough to feed the greedy appetite of impure rumour for a long while. At the gardens of Marly, with a company of ladies and gentlemen, she took a ride at night to the hills to see the sunrise, and this adventure was pronounced a covert plan of licentiousness. After an unusual fall of snow, she got up a sleigh ride in the streets of Paris with rich equipage, to the surprise of all the people, who accused her of a design to introduce Austrian customs. In private theatricals she performed as an actress, and in private parties she gleefully engaged in such simple sports as blind man's buff, to the general indignation of all sticklers for dignity. In short, there was no end of the stories set afloat by cunning persons, and every incident was converted into caricature, a defamatory picture, or a song to be sung by the street beggars. She was even insulted often to her face, when she imprudently assumed a mask and mingled with promenaders on the avenues. After a reign of 19 years, the slowly gathering storm that long had darkened over the heads of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette broke in the thundering tread, the lightning violence and torrent rush of the mobs of 1789. Tattered, haggard, and drunken crowds, emerging from the dens of Paris, raged through the streets, armed with pikes, clubs, and every instrument that could be converted into a weapon of attack. The king insisted on gentle measures, and, when his troops were driven from the city, he collected his army around him at Versailles. The capital was abandoned to the infuriated people, who levelled the Bastille to the ground, and sacked every house they chose to invade. It is in vain to follow the course of events, and attempt to give the scenes of the revolution in detail. The eye need be fastened now upon the queen alone, in all the awful trials through which she passed to the scaffold. A few brief paragraphs only are required to set forth her heroic portrait on the dark and confused background of that reign of terror. From the first, the determination of her mother was kindled within her. She vainly urged the king to take decided steps to force down the rebellion. When he was absent on his dangerous and fruitless visit to the National Assembly at Paris, she prepared to follow him to the last extremity. On his return, at a banquet of the military officers, she, together with him, excited as wild enthusiasm as did her mother among the Hungarians at Pressburg. And when the monster mob rushed from the city, dragged its mighty bulk along the road to Versailles, to coil its slimy and bristling convolutions around the palace itself, and shake its thousands of hissing tongues in the very sanctuary of royalty, she, urged to fly with her children, would not desert her lord, but said, quote, "Nothing shall induce me in such an extremity to be separated from my husband. I know that they seek my life, but I am the daughter of Maria Theresa, and I have not learned to fear death." End quote. It was the evening of a dismal, rainy day, when the delirious and countless multitude reached Versailles to hold its hideous orgies all night in the gardens and cottages. Assured of protection by Lafayette, commander of the guard, the Queen, when it was nearly daylight the next day, endeavored to get an hour's repose. But she had hardly closed her eyes before the swarming ruffians broke into the palace, and thundered at the door of her chamber. She had barely escaped to the apartments of the king, when they shivered the door of her own, and plunged their pikes and knives into her empty bed. The next day her courage rose to sublimity. Beholding her trusty soldiers butchered in the courtyard of the palace, she undoubtedly presented herself at the windows, while bullets were flying around her, and she refused the protection of a friend who threw himself before her. She declared that the king could not afford to lose so faithful a subject as he. The crowd called for her to show herself in the balcony. She came forward with her children, thinking to move their sympathy. They at once roared forth the cry, "Away with the children!" Without an instant's hesitation or a change of color in her face, she sent away the children, and stood alone in the balcony, lifting her eyes to God, with clasped hands, and resigned to fall the next moment as a ransom for her family. A dead silence struck the mad concourse. They were overwhelmed at her sublime self-sacrifice, and suddenly from every throat went up the shout, "Live the Queen! Live the Queen!" With a purposeless frenzy, the poor, misguided, famished, and intoxicated mob demanded that the king should return with them to the city. The Queen would not be parted from him, and beyond all description was the ride of theirs to Paris, borne along as they were for 7 hours by a flood of desperate creatures, who loaded them with abuse, endangered their lives by frequent shots, and shocked them by the bloody heads of the slaughtered guard, carried on pikes, and thrust before the windows of their carriage. 30,000 madmen, armed with every possible weapon, surrounded the cortege, and women, crazed with poverty, crime, and rum, were seated on the cannon that were rolled along, and sang ribald songs in ridicule of the Queen. The feelings of a mother were too strong in her for any dismay on her own account. She held her boy on her knee, and tried to soothe his terrors. For 2 years the sovereigns were little more than prisoners in the palaces of the Tuileries and St. Cloud. The National Guard surrounded them, day and night, ostensibly to protect, but really to hold them captive, and constantly were they threatened with assassination. Marie Antoinette in vain entreated her husband to use active measures to assert his authority, or else to fly to the frontiers. He possessed a calm and indomitable courage in endurance, but had none for action, and he believed that repeated concessions to the demands of the people would at last satisfy them. and so she devoted herself to the instruction of her children, or employed herself with embroidery, maintaining a serene and cheerful fortitude during all those months of alarm. Many plans for their secret escape were formed by their friends. These plots were either divulged and the instigators beheaded, or, if nearly successful, were defeated by the inaction of Louis. At length the case became too desperate for even his passive nature. He and his wife were falsely accused of exciting the rally of the Allied powers, who were now collecting an army that threatened to march upon Paris and suppress the revolution with fire and sword. The royal family were openly denounced in the National Assembly as traitors to their country. The scheme of flight was matured after long and anxious deliberation. The royal family retired as usual on the night of the 20th of June, 1791, at 11 o'clock. No sooner were they in their rooms than they disguised themselves, and departing by the rear doors of the palace and taking separate routes through the obscurest streets of Paris, they sought the rendezvous appointed for them to take the coaches prepared. The Queen, leading her daughter and accompanied by one of her bodyguard, arrived soon at the place agreed upon, but had to wait a long time in extreme anxiety for the King, who had lost his way. In silent and agonizing apprehension they met, entered their carriages, and were rapidly driven with relays of horses, all that night and the next day, to Varennes, 180 miles from Paris. Before reaching that town, they had been recognized, and the news of their approach sent in advance. The circumstances cannot be rehearsed. A crowd collected. The King declared himself and appealed to the people, but vainly. They had arrived there in the evening. All night the Queen remained in the mayor's house. It was the night of her intensest agony, and in the morning her hair, which before was a beautiful brown, was found to have turned white in consequence of her indescribable misery. The return to Paris, the next day and night after their arrest, was a repetition of the terrible journey to Versailles, only now it was 18 times the distance, and their distress was heightened by utter exhaustion and hopelessness. Riotous crowds thronged the road, cursing and jeering the captives, or attempting to fall upon them like greedy wolves, and old men who ventured a look or gesture of respect towards their king were massacred before his eyes without mercy. Amidst suffocating multitudes, dust and heat, and fainting with thirst and terror at more daring menaces, they entered the city. As the doors of the palace closed upon them, a universal cry of rage rent the air and was prolonged to their ears like reverberating thunder. Guards kept their eyes upon the Queen every moment, day and night, to the outrage of her modesty and to the disgrace of humanity. The King for days was struck dumb with despair, and at last Marie cast herself with her children before him, saying, quote, "We may all perish, but let us at least perish like sovereigns, and not wait to be strangled unresistingly upon the very floor of our apartments." End quote. And Madame Elisabeth, sister of the King, the other heroine of these scenes, and a most saintly woman, assisted in cheering the unfortunate monarch. And bravely did he arouse himself and face the brutal mob that broke into the palace prison the next day, to revenge themselves for his refusal to authorize a persecution of the priest. They came with banners, one of which was a doll hung up by the neck, and beneath it the words, "To the gibbet with the Austrian." They wrenched down the doors and rioted through the splendid apartments, destroying everything in their way, and pressed upon the King and Queen, who were only saved by maintaining extraordinary composure and uttering some popular expressions. Some sentiment of the sacredness of royal persons seemed to have remained, and held back the frantic concourse like a magic spell. For hours the family were exposed to the rush and gaze of the populace, until the President of the Assembly succeeded in dispersing them. Further attempts to poison or assassinate the queen were made, and many insults endured by her. It is in vain to enumerate them. It is adding the same colors to the terrific picture. The mob, in August 1792, demanded that the king should be dethroned, and again attacked the Tuileries, at which they pointed their loaded cannon. An officer urged the family to take refuge in the National Assembly. Marie resisted the proposal, and seizing the officer's pistol, placed them in the hands of Louis and said, quote, "Now, sire, is the time to show yourself, and if we must perish, let us perish with glory." End quote. But, subdued at the sight of her children, she consented to go. Fearful was their passage through the bloodthirsty crowd, while their friends were butchered, and long were the hours of suspense as they sat in a box behind the seat of the President of the Assembly. But they never trembled nor quailed. The Queen gazed steadfastly and indignantly, like the very statue of outraged majesty, at the excited assembly. The king was dethroned, and, with his family, was imprisoned in the monastery of the Feuillants. Afterwards, they were incarcerated in a gloomy fortress called the Temple. The reign of terror was at its height, and nothing but the strength of their dungeon saved them from the foaming desire of the city to add their royal blood to the streams of human gore that deluged the streets. Months passed, their few comforts were gradually withdrawn. One by one they were separated. The king was executed. Her son was taken from the queen, and so abused in his confinement that he afterwards became insane and died. And on the 14th of October 1793, 4 months after her husband's death, Marie Antoinette fell a victim to the busy and dread guillotine. When they tore her son from her, she resisted the cruelty with furious desperation. And when they took her from her daughter, she accidentally struck her own forehead against the door, and to the question whether she was hurt, she said with the preternatural calmness of an utterly broken heart, quote, "Oh no, nothing now can further hurt me." End quote. In the damp, dark, loathsome underground dungeon of the Conciergerie, the place of the doomed, the daughter of Maria Theresa, the admired and gay queen of St. Cloud and Versailles, awaited her fate. She had stood up before the vociferous and exulting spectators at the tribunal, and heard her sentence without the quivering of a nerve, and without stooping to offer a word of defense, though the most groundless charges were uttered against her. And now she knelt in her cell, prayed, and then slept as tranquilly as if she were reposing on the satin damask of her Petit Trianon, after a stroll among flowers and fountains. 2 hours of slumber passed. She was awakened, and dressed in the only fine garments that she had preserved amidst her soiled array. She wore a white loose robe, pure as her innocence, with a cap and black ribbon on her head. The day was cold and misty. At 11 o'clock her hands were bound. She was placed in a rough cart, and jolted along through the crowd that cried, "Down with the Austrian!" One glance at that scene of her pleasures and woes, the Tuileries, and she ascended the scaffold, knelt, and said, quote, "Lord, enlighten and soften the hearts of my executioners. Adieu forever, my children. I go to join your father." End quote. Her children, in their distant dungeons, heard not the words, but we may trust that they were heard in heaven. The glittering yet blood-stained blade fell, the executioner lifted her head by the prematurely white hair, and the air echoed to the cry, "Vive la République!" In her grave, where now stands the Church of the Madeleine, were buried 38 years of as joyous youth, splendid pleasures, and awful tortures as ever fell to the lot of a mortal. Hers was a wild, beautiful, and noble nature, gentle, yet tameless. ensnared from first to last in an unparalleled series of events, and slowly tortured to life's close by miseries which a superhuman ingenuity could not have more terribly devised than did her enemies. End of section 37.
Section 38 of the Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Reese. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins. Madame Roland, Part 1. Madame Roland. The mind is its own place. Milton. Great events are the pedestals that bear aloft noble and beautiful characters, which might else lie low in obscurity. Nay, they are the chisel strokes which give bold prominence to characters that might otherwise have been unskilfully shaped, or destined to grace only a hidden niche. The revolutions that have repeatedly convulsed France must necessarily have furnished numerous subjects for history. Though there are many whose career was longer and more brilliant, there are few, if any, who came forth from the lower ranks of life, and secured, by their talent, such influence over intelligent minds as was gained by Madame Roland. Gifted with a vivid imagination, balanced by strong good sense, quick perceptions, and clear reasoning powers, and inspired by an ambition to emulate the old Roman heroines in the achievement of some great and virtuous deed, it is not surprising that she should have soared above the humble sphere in which her girlhood was placed, even had not her father's bitter denunciations against the all-powerful aristocracy, or the spirit which pervaded the lower classes before the outburst of the Revolution, given shape and direction to her aspirations. Jean Manon Roland was born in 1754, in an humble home on the Quai d'Oeuvres, Paris. Her father, called Gratien Philippon, was an engraver, and daily superintended the thrifty shop with its busy workmen, which was the source of his limited fortune. By industry, economy, and the assistance of a prudent wife, he had secured comfortable apartments above the shop, where they lived as happily as his restless, fretful disposition would allow. At the time of Manon's birth, he had grown discontented with his lot in life. Hatred burned in his heart toward the pampered nobility who rolled in wealth, while he and his fellow laborers were made to yield an unjust portion of their hard earnings to support the luxury of arrogant superiors. Madame Philippon had no sympathy with the feverish discontent of her more ambitious husband. Of a cheerful, placid temperament, she was satisfied to remain in the position in which God had placed her, and with the faith and fortitude of a Christian, performed in unquestioning readiness whatever she found for her hands to do. Thus to a virtuous, pious mother, and an infidel father, was given a young spirit ready for the moulding hand of good or evil. Had Manon been one of several children, she might have been left more to her mother's guidance and instruction, but the only surviving child of 8, lively and precocious, pretty and winning, her father took her into his arms and heart, made her the constant companion of his leisure hours, and as she grew older carried or led her through the streets of Paris, listening with delight to her childish comments on the passers-by. Proud of the bright little Manon, he was maddened with resentment and envy at the sight of gilded coaches in which lolled richly dressed ladies, and children muffled in expensive garments fastened with jewels, any one of which would have given a coveted education to the poor artisan's daughter. Philippon gave vent to his anger in vociferous words which Manon did not comprehend, though they left a vague idea of an injured father and a dislike to dashing chariots and finely dressed people, as the cause of his distress. The reflective mind of the little philosopher soon grasped and studied out the lessons her father gave. Before she reached the age when children are most occupied with pastimes, her head was full of the arrogance of royalty and nobility, and of schemes to fraternize and obtain equality among mankind. With no playmates, no pure air, green fields, forests, and gay songsters to impart the freedom and abandonment of childhood, with no diversion except daily walks in a crowded city with her father, who always took these occasions to teach her the wrongs of the oppressed poor, and too young to be of assistance to her mother at home, her busy mind found occupation, delight, and rest from her father's nervous suggestions, in stealing away to her quiet little chamber, and forgetting all the world in the perusal of her library, though this was so limited that she could number the books upon her fingers any day. Plutarch's Lives was her especial delight, a book she read and reread with an avidity that stored nearly the whole of it in her memory. Her soul was awake to all that was beautiful or sublime, whether manifested in the works of nature, art, or the deeds of mankind. These pursuits did not interfere with her usefulness in the household. She was cheerfully obedient to her mother's commands, and uncomplainingly laid down a pet book when her assistance was required in domestic duties. Thus she became skilled in culinary arts, of which she said in her after life, "I can prepare my own dinner with as much address as Philopomen cut wood," and congratulated herself that her judicious mother had prepared her for the vicissitudes that marked her maturer years. Madame Philippon's high tone of piety, together with her gentle instructions, soon won Manon's confidence. She readily perceived the superiority of a religion that cultivated peace, fortitude, and uprightness in its possessor, in strong contrast with the overbearing impatience and fretful repinings which her father's principles infused into his daily life. She chose the former, and for months religion was predominant in her pensive meditations, till her active mind was wrought up to an unendurable state of excitement. The cloister presented itself to her ardent imagination as the only method of attaining the saintly purity to which she aspired, and as a place of holiness and retirement most suitable for preparation for her first Christian communion. One evening she threw herself in tears at her mother's feet, beseeching her to send her to a convent. Madame Philippon was deeply affected at the request. She did not hesitate to gratify a zeal, equally commended by the father, who desired to give Manon such an education as she could only obtain in a convent. After some difficulty in making a choice of the numerous religious houses, the convent of the Sisterhood of the Congregation in Paris was decided upon, as being conducted with less strictness and fewer of the extravagances of Catholic worship than most of the nunneries. Manon was accompanied thither by her good mother. The thought of the long parting from her beloved mother brought torrents of tears, and when the moment of separation arrived, the sensitive but courageous child was overcome with grief. In the memoirs that she penned while confined in prison, she says of this separation, "While pressing my dear mother in my arms at the moment of parting with her for the first time in my life, I thought my heart would have broken. But I was acting in obedience to the voice of God, and passed the threshold of the cloister, offering up to him with tears the great sacrifice I was capable of making." This was on the 7th of May, 1765, when I was 11 years and 2 months old. In the gloom of a prison, in the midst of those political commotions which ravage my country, and sweep away all that is dear to me, how shall I recall to my mind, and how describe that period of rapture and tranquillity? What lively colors can express the soft emotions of a young heart endued with tenderness and sensibility, greedy of happiness, beginning to be alive to the feelings of nature, and perceiving the Deity alone? The first night I spent at the convent was a night of agitation. I was no longer under the paternal roof. I was at a distance from that kind mother, who was doubtless thinking of me with affectionate emotion. A dim light suffused itself through the room in which I had been put to bed, with 4 children of my own age. I stole softly from my couch and drew near the window, the light of the moon enabling me to distinguish the garden which it overlooked. The deepest silence prevailed, and I listened to it, if I may use the expression, with a sort of respect. Lofty trees cast their gigantic shadows along the ground, and promised a secure asylum to peaceful meditation. I lifted up my eyes to the heavens. They were unclouded and serene. I imagined I felt the presence of the Deity smiling on my sacrifice, and already offering me a reward in the consolatory peace of a celestial abode. Tears of delight flowed gently down my cheeks. I repeated my vows with holy ecstasy, and went to bed again to take the slumber of God's chosen children. Here, in the society of young girls of various ages, Manon remained for a year. Her womanly conduct and intellectual acquirements very soon gained her the favor and affection of the whole sisterhood, and the association of the young ladies placed under their tuition. She never mingled in the sports of younger companions, nor the recreations of older ones, much preferring to steal away by herself in some remote corner of the garden, with her books, or pacing the avenues to enjoy in quiet rapture the sight of blooming flowers, quivering leaves, or trailing branches of the shade trees. and the fleecy clouds flitting over the blue space above her, narrowly bounded by the high convent walls. Every other moment was busily employed with her books. Romances, legends, lives of the saints, biography, travels, history, political philosophy, poetry. Nothing escaped the grasp of her active mind. The nuns, to whose care she was committed, were proud of her progress. Her music and drawing masters were equally profuse in the praises of a pupil who never allowed an obstacle to check her rapid advance. Caressed, loved, and commended without measure, she had good sense enough not to be spoiled. She was the especial favorite of an antiquated sister of 70 years, whose diminutive figure, preciseness of manner, and affectation of sanctity, which nevertheless concealed a warm heart, made an indelible impression on the lively imagination of her thoughtful pupil. She led her away to her own dimly lighted cell, and there chatted for hours with the young listener, who received the old nun's lessons or tales with an avidity redoubled by the solitude of the cell. Her influence assisted to sharpen Manon's already too active emotions, and imparted such a degree of intensity to her religious fervor that when the season for communion arrived, the child was so overcome that she could not support herself, and was carried to the altar by the nuns. Everything within the convent contributed to nourish and increase the unhealthy excitement of Manon's sensitive nature. The event of a young girl taking the white veil occurred some months after her entrance into the convent. The sight of the church and altar decorated with flowers, and enriched with silken draperies, the brilliant lights, the gaily dressed crowd that assembled to witness the ceremony, above all the entombed bride with her white veil, rolling volumes of dark hair, the crown of roses, the pale, beautiful, downcast face, excited the sympathy of the affectionate Manon. And when the bridal dress was exchanged for one of sombre hue, her head dismantled of its crowning beauty, and her form extended with folding hands beneath a black pall, the excited child, imagining herself in the place of the victim, could no longer repress her emotions, and burst into an uncontrollable paroxysm of tears. Such scenes, the daily sights and sounds of vesper bells, the hooded monks and shrouded nuns in the taper-lighted chapel, the gloomy burials at night by torchlight, were all fitted to oppress the child's spirit with awe, and fill her with yearnings for secluded holiness and death, instead of healthy, active exertion in behalf of mankind. It was an excessive and mistaken religious zeal, which she threw off with its imposing and beguiling rites, for the other extreme of philosophy and infidelity, when arrived at womanhood. There was but one among the inmates of the convent whom Manon singled out as her friend and confidant, one for whom she always maintained an unchanged attachment. The usual quiet routine of convent life was broken one day by the arrival of two young ladies, an event that excited the curiosity of the young girls shut out from the world. "Who are they? What are they like?" were questions that sped unanswered from lip to lip of a group in the garden, bent upon a scrutiny of the two young ladies led thither by the superior. One was 18, finely formed, of proud but easy carriage, with a face that had strong claims to beauty, when not disfigured by an expression of discontent and fretfulness. She had previously completed her convent education, but was returned by her mother in order to put in check her ungovernable temper, and to accompany her younger, more amiable, and timid sister. The latter, 14, with a modest air and sweet countenance bathed in tears, attracted the sympathy and love of the impressible Manon the moment their eyes met. From the day of Sophia's arrival the two were inseparable. Sophia was henceforth the receptacle of all the dreams, the aspirations, and the philosophical musings of the mature child, wearied and overburdened with the pent-up thoughts and emotions daily crowding into her mind and heart. This was not a transient schoolgirl friendship. It was one sustained in an unfailing correspondence after their separation. Madame Roland owed as much of the facility and clearness of expression visible in her writings to the frequent letters she early exchanged with her friend, as to the habitual practice of taking notes from the books she perused, and interlining them with her own thoughts and opinions. When the year of her stay at the convent had expired, her mother placed her under the care of her grandmother Philippon, a graceful, good-humoured woman of 65 years, still possessing agreeable manners, and an occasional mirthfulness that made her a favourite with the young. But her prominent characteristic was the precision with which she enforced and observed decorum. The little courtesies and elegances of manner were of the highest importance in her judgment. Her unpretending, pleasant home was on the banks of the Seine, commanding a lively view of the winding river, and a wide landscape beyond. This was a charming retreat where Manon could indulge her meditative, studious habits to her heart's content. Every morning she attended Mass with her great aunt Angelica, a worthy maiden, asthmatic and devout, as virtuous as an angel and as simple as a child, and entirely devoted to her elder sister with whom she lived. A third sister, Madame Besnard, came frequently to visit them, always keeping up an air of ceremony and formality that greatly exceeded even Madame Philippon. Manon was most frequently the theme of their conversation, Madame Besnard insisting with a shrug of the shoulders that the child would be spoiled, while the good Angelica, meek, quiet, and pale, busy with her spectacles and knitting, assured the two precise old ladies that Manon had good sense enough to take care of herself, and continued to pet her as before. Madame Philippon was so delighted and proud of her granddaughter's accomplishments that she was induced to display her talent and prettiness before a wealthy lady, of whose children she had formerly been governess. Accordingly, Manon was decked in holiday dress, and the greatest preparation and care bestowed upon her appearance. Arriving at the mansion, they were greeted by the servants with the greatest respect, and as they passed on, the maids, attracted by the long dark ringlets and blooming cheeks of the young visitor, ventured to compliment her. Manon's pride rose at the familiarity, and without replying she followed her ceremonious grandmother to the elegant apartments of Madame Bosmarel. The lady received them in a cold, condescending tone of voice, without rising, and continued the embroidery upon which she was engaged. She addressed her dignified visitor with the flippant title of Mademoiselle, and openly remarked upon Madon's blooming face. The indignant girl's countenance was suffused with blushes, and her heart swelled with scorn and resentment, that her venerated grandmother should be regarded with so little respect, and that she herself, conscious of superior worth and aspiring to the nobleness of a Roman maiden, should be looked down upon by this arrogant lady, and treated as an equal by her servants. Manon was glad when the interview terminated, and retreated with her pulse throbbing and her face crimsoned with mortified pride and anger. Again under their own humble roof, she returned to her studies, her head teeming with speculations upon the inequality of rank, that awakened from their long sleep the prejudices of her childhood. At the expiration of a year, Manon returned to the parental roof. Her music and dancing masters were recalled, and she resumed her studies with more assiduity than ever. Every book within her reach was carefully perused. Locke, Pascal, Burlamaque, Montesquieu, Voltaire were familiar authors. An occasional poem or a romance relieved her severer studies. The long winter evenings she spent beside her mother with her needlework, or read aloud, to which, however, she had a decided aversion, as it prevented the close inquiry and study she indulged when poring over the pages by herself. She had the use of a library belonging to the Abbé Leger, a warm-hearted old man, with little else to recommend him, but with whom Gratien Philippon and his family spent their Sabbath evenings. The Abbé's household was superintended by a distant relative, Mademoiselle Danache. She was a source of infinite amusement to the discerning Manon. Advanced in years, yet preserving a youthful style of dress, tall, thin, and sallow, with a shrill voice forever recounting her pedigree, of which she was intolerably proud, possessing no talent but for a stingy economy and scolding. She was destined to become one of Manon's attachés, and as inseparable as her own shadow for a year and a half. The Abbé Leger, terminating his own life, left his poor relative without a home. Madame Philippon had compassion for her solitary condition, and offered her an asylum till the suit she had instituted for the recovery of an uncle's property was decided. During this time Manon was her secretary. She wrote letters and petitions for her, and often accompanied her when she went to intercede with influential persons. Mademoiselle Danache was extremely illiterate and ill-bred. She therefore depended upon Manon's ready tact on all occasions, but when they went together on these errands, the young philosopher was filled with disgust and contempt on seeing the obsequious attentions her whimsical, ignorant friend received, the moment the ready names of her long line of titled ancestry dropped from her nimble tongue, with as good effect as if they had been pearls falling from the lips of beauty, while she, the one of true nobility, stood unnoticed and slighted, feeling her superiority, and revolving in her busy mind the absurd and unjust institutions of society. End of section 38. Recording by Matthew Reese, Davenport, Iowa. Section 39 of the Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Reese. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins. Madame Roland, Part 2. At 15, Manon was graceful and pleasing. Her face was attractive from its varying expression, frank, lively, and tender, often lofty and serious. The irregularity of her features was atoned for by her clear, fresh complexion and the brilliancy of her hazel eyes. Modest and reserved, an inferior person would scarcely have suspected her strong talents, but when she came in contact with cultivated minds, she was transformed from a timid, blushing maiden to a brilliant, self-possessed woman with a soul that beamed through every feature, giving animation and indisputable beauty to a face that otherwise would have been plain. Thinking to amuse her, Madame Philippon decided upon a trip to Versailles accompanied by Mademoiselle d'Hannaches and an uncle, an amiable young clergyman as an escort. They occupied apartments in the palace, which happened to be vacated by one of the Dauphiness women, and amused themselves with being spectators of the royal public and private dinners, and witnessing some of the splendors of palace life. Mademoiselle d'Hannaches, by her forward airs and noisy thrusting of her pedigree in the face of everyone who opposed her passage, drew attention upon the little party wherever they went, much to Manon's mortification. She looked thoughtfully upon the gaily dressed crowds about her, despised the fawning courtiers, and gazed with indignation upon the grand fêtes, the brilliant equipages, and the luxuriant apartments of the palace, contrasting them with the squalid homes and the pale emaciated crowds that went forth in daily labour, and from whom was wrenched half their scanty pittance, to support this splendour. Neither could her high spirit brook the notice of menials and the slights of court sycophants, whom she felt to be immeasurably beneath her. Instead of being amused with the daily show, she wandered away to the gardens to forget her disgust in admiration of the flowers and the statues that graced them. Yet even there was tormented with thoughts of despotism and oppression, and sighed that she had not been born a Grecian maiden. Her mother, observing Manon's abstraction, asked how she enjoyed the visit. "I shall be glad when it is ended," was her characteristic reply, "else in a few more days I shall so detest all the persons I see that I shall not know what to do with my hatred." "Why? What harm have these persons done you?" said Madame Philippon. "They make me feel injustice, and look upon absurdity," replied the young sage. She was happy to be buried again in the retirement of her own home. Sophia Canet, her friend of the convent, having arrived at Paris with her brother, drew Manon more into society, and enabled her to meet people of rank, whose ignorance and supercilious airs she often had occasion to despise, and also gave her friends among authors and people of distinguished talent. She had attained an age and attractiveness that could not escape attention, and thenceforth Manon had numberless suitors who, according to the customs of France, were first obliged to apply to her parents, an embarrassing ceremony that was most frequently performed by letter-writing. In consequence, suitors were often dismissed by her father whom she had never seen. She was satisfied to judge of them by the tone of the application, and concurred in the dismission of one tradesman after another, often writing the replies herself, which were carefully copied and sent by her father. When a wealthy jeweller appeared, Philippon was caught by the glitter of his occupation and his promising prospects of accumulating a large fortune. He urged upon Manon the expediency of accepting this suitor, but she was dissatisfied with his attainments, and assured her parents she could only be happy with one whom she could look upon as her equal or superior. This refusal occasioned the beginning of the estrangement between herself and father, which was never reconciled. Upon the appearance of a young physician, her parents thought the aspiring Manon would not hesitate to accept one of a profession that involved some degree of learning. Her mother, whose declining health made her anxious to see her daughter happily provided with a home, concerted with the young doctor to win Manon's affections. A first interview was carefully arranged. Madame Philippon conducted her daughter, as if unpremeditated, to the house of a friend, where the enamoured suitor happened in by chance, of course. The profuse compliments of the inexperienced physician and the sly hints and meaning smiles of the ladies who accompanied him soon betrayed the whole plan to the penetrating Manon, and caused her to look with infinite contempt upon the silly artifices of her admirer. She consented, however, to her mother's urgent entreaties to receive his visits and decide more leisurely, but a farther acquaintance betrayed his superficial acquirements, and the girl, whose intellect was to be won instead of her heart, gave him as decided a refusal as those who had gone before. In vain her father raged and stormed, and even the tender, sad pleadings of her invalid mother could not change her determination. "Do not reject a husband," said her mother, "who, it is true, does not possess the refinement you desire, but who will love you and with whom you can be happy." "As happy as you have been?" exclaimed Manon in her excitement, referring to the utter disunion of spirit between her father and mother. Madame Philippon's face was pale with painful emotion, and she never urged the subject again. Not long after, Manon returned hastily from a visit, filled with presentiments of evil, and found her mother suddenly ill, and unable to speak. A priest was summoned to perform the last rites, and Manon, sobbing violently, stood by the death-bed holding a taper. Her mother smiled upon her and smoothed her cheek affectionately, till, overcome with the intensity of her grief, she fell senseless to the floor. The light was extinguished, and when she again recovered, her mother was no more. The violence of her unchecked sorrow occasioned an illness from which her recovery was long doubtful. An excursion and soothing visit to her Aunt Angelica somewhat restored her cheerfulness, but her home was no longer what it had been. Her father was rapidly pursuing a career of dissipation, to which his infidel principles gave loose reins, his business neglected, his little fortune rapidly vanishing, ensnaring in the toils of one not endeared by sacred ties, and whom he installed the quiet household. All contributed to repel his daughter's affection. She endeavoured to forget her grief and her melancholy in her retired chamber, where nearly all her time was passed, absorbed in books and writing manuscripts which never met any eyes but her own. While thus solitary and desponding, a letter from her early friend Sophia announced a visitor of whom she had often heard. Roland de la Platière belonged to an opulent family of Amiens, and held the important office of inspector of manufactures. During his leisure he had written several treatises on political economy that had gained him some celebrity in the world. He was fond of study, and was something of a philosopher. In his frequent visits to the house of M. Canet, he had seen Manon's portrait, and often listened to Sophia's eulogies upon her accomplished friend, and had read her letters. His interest was excited in the enthusiastic and talented girl, and he entreated a letter of introduction, that he might be enabled to see her during his occasional trips to Paris. He accordingly presented himself at the first opportunity. Manon was prepared to judge of him by the sketch justly drawn by Sophia. "You will receive this letter," wrote her friend, "by the hand of the philosopher of whom I have so often written you. Monsieur Roland is an enlightened man, of antique manners, without reproach, except for his passion for the ancients, his contempt for the moderns, and his too high estimation of himself." Manon found herself in the presence of one who she describes as tall, slender, and well-formed, but negligent in his carriage, and with that stiffness which is often contracted by study. Yet his manners were simple and easy, and without possessing the fashionable graces, he combined the politeness of a well-bred man with the gravity of a philosopher. He was thin, with a complexion much tanned. His broad, intellectual brow, covered with but a few hairs, added to the imposing attractiveness of regular features. When listening, his countenance expressed deep thoughtfulness, and often sadness, but once interested and animated in conversation, his face was lighted with lively and winning smiles. His voice was masculine, his language monotonous and harsh, but the sentiments he expressed so perfectly accorded with Manon's views that she felt herself attracted by a sympathy as new as it was delightful. Though his severe and practical mind admitted none of the beautiful dreams of the visionary world that added so much to Manon's happiness, there was yet that sameness of high ambition to be the benefactor of the human race, a conscious superiority over those whose rank gave them higher places, and a contempt for the frivolous pursuits of life, that perfectly harmonized their minds, though the heart of neither was touched. Manon regarded him as a superior being, an oracle to whom she was willing to submit her judgment, while he, flattered by the succumbing of her brilliant mind to his, regarded her with placid and paternal admiration. Upon M. Roland's departure from Paris, he left with his new friend voluminous manuscripts, containing a journal of recent travels in Germany, with sage reflections that rendered them doubly interesting to Manon. In their perusal, she became initiated in his thoughts and feelings to a far greater extent than conversation could ever have afforded her. 18 months elapsed before they met again. In the meantime, Roland traveled through Italy, Switzerland, Sicily, and Malta, writing copious notes and forwarding them at regular intervals to Manon, who studied them with an avidity and interest that prepared her to hail his return with joy and veneration nearly allied to worship. Yet there was not a spark of love growing in her bosom. It was only her intellect that singled him out from the rest of the world. Several years passed in friendly correspondence, or interviews, during which they discussed political reforms, philosophy and science, and various literary projects, with a frankness, confidence, and pleasure that, before they were aware of it, each became necessary to the other's happiness. M. Roland at length declared his attachment. Manon frankly acknowledged that she esteemed him more highly than anyone she ever met. Yet her circumstances were so humble. Her father's heirs would be a source of disgrace and mortification, and the well-known pride of the Roland family, who might feel dishonored by the alliance, were reasons for which her proud spirit shrank from a union otherwise unobjectionable. M. Roland would not yield to these representations, and finally elicited her consent. From that moment the reliance, trust, and affection she had not known since her mother's death again nestled in her heart, and she was happy. M. Roland returned to Amiens, and then addressed a letter to her father to obtain his consent to their marriage. M. Philippon replied in an insulting tone, and bluntly refused him. Manon, surprised and grieved, immediately wrote to her revered friend, and besought him to think no more of the affair, and not to expose himself to farther affronts by new solicitations. At the same time, she assured her father she would marry no one else, secured a small remnant of her mother's fortune, and retired to the same convent where a year of her childhood had passed. In a narrow little room, close under the roof where the snow lay piled up, or the rain pattered dismally, without a companion, obliged to live with the strictest frugality, with no friendly voice to dispel the settled silence. Here Manon lived, enjoying a peaceful, quiet happiness in the midst of literary labours that no mere seeker of pleasure ever found in the delirious whirl of gaiety or in luxurious idleness. The comfortless surroundings of uncurtained windows, bare floor, dim light, and scanty fire could not depress her spirit, but rather lent new and stronger wings to an imagination that continually roamed to the ends of the earth or far back into bygone ages, and brought therefrom abundant lessons to revolve. Disciplined by the particular circumstances of her life, and accustomed to live within herself, she was least alone when alone. She daily prepared her own frugal food, never went out except on the occasion of a weekly visit to her father's house to mend his linen and to have a care for his interests, and received no visitors beside one of the sisters in the convent, who was limited to an hour in the evening. Who would have dreamed, in passing the quiet convent, that by the light shining dimly from the high window under the eaves sat a solitary maiden, unconsciously pruning her intellect for a bold patriotic appeal that was to shake the throne of France, unknowingly preparing herself to sway the deliberations of statesmen, and destined to tread in stately and conscious worth the halls of a palace. She lost no time in useless repinings, but applied herself vigorously and diligently to the cultivation of such talents as God had committed to her, without questioning the future, dark and gloomy enough to her lonely eyes. It was unfortunate that she had no guide to lead her out of the mazes in which she had lost her way after rejecting the Catholic creed, as hollow and heartless, with the outward forms but not the essence of spirituality. Yet she dared reveal her doubts to no one, and still preserved outward conformity to her mother's belief. Here M. Roland again visited her, at the expiration of 5 or 6 months. He presented himself at the convent one day, and beheld Manon's pale face behind the grating, which, with the sweet sound of her voice, revived the affection that had nearly died out when he ceased to think of her as his intended bride. Touched by her lonely condition and her faithfulness to him, he urgently renewed his suit. Manon hesitated. She no longer cherished the romantic love with which she regarded him at their last parting, and her pride and vanity were wounded that he had endured a refusal he knew to be against her inclination with such unlover-like apathy. Farther consideration, however, suggested the compliment his deliberate decision paid her, and the sacrifice of family considerations his renewed offer implied. Manon no longer deliberated. She resolutely placed her hand in his, and though more intellect than heart went with it, M. Roland was satisfied and happy. Their marriage occurred in 1780. Manon, still youthful at 25, was at length wedded to an austere, self-confident, overbearing man, 20 years her senior. The first year was spent in Paris, entirely occupied in the preparation of a work on the arts, in which Madame Roland untiringly assisted her husband. Her only recreation was attending a course of lectures on natural history and botany. She secluded herself from her friends, not from her own choice, but because her imperious husband demanded it. He wished to absorb her attention and affection entirely in himself. The succeeding 4 years were passed at Amiens, occupied as before in literary pursuits, to which Madame Roland lent her own pen with a brilliancy of style that gave an additional reputation to Roland's works. The birth of a daughter divided her cares and pursuits, but she had become so indispensable to her husband that for the sake of her grateful presence he was quite ready to submit to the mischievous play of little fingers among his books and papers. The sunny face of Eudora, peeping out from her long flaxen ringlets, now and then laughingly thrust between her father's face and his endless manuscripts, did much towards softening his habitual sternness. Madame Roland, too, centred in this sweet child the affections that were but rudely and selfishly cherished by her exacting husband. It was in the course of this stay at Amiens that Monsieur Roland applied for letters patent of nobility, wishing to resume the title of his ancestry, now that his wealth was sufficient to support such rank. His wife was not unwilling to bear the gracious title of Lady Roland, in spite of her previous contempt of titled nobility, and meditations upon the inequality of mankind. It was a temptation neither of them would have rejected, had their application been successful. In 1785, Monsieur Roland removed to the city of Lyons. The family occupied a winter residence in town, but passed the summers upon a fine paternal estate a few miles from Lyons. La Platière was a rural retreat, lying in the valley of the Saône, at the foot of the mountains of Beaujolais. It was a wild, romantic region, intersected with deep gorges and watered by impetuous torrents that leapt and foamed down the mountain-sides. Then, rushing noisily through the fertile valley, swelled the wide-rolling Saône to overflowing. Fruitful vineyards grew purple in the warm sheltered valley, and the smooth green meadows were dotted with flocks of white sheep guarded by shepherds. In the midst of these meadows and vineyards stretched the La Platière farm, with its sleek cattle, its dovecotes, fish-ponds, gardens, and groups of willows with their long sweeping boughs, and tall prim poplars shading the solid square stone house and its numberless outhouses. The mansion, spacious and airy, had nothing to recommend it in the way of ornamental architecture. A plain front, the roof projecting and nearly flat, regular windows, and a plain portico at the entrance, told more of unpretending comfort than taste or display. Madame Roland, accustomed only to a life among brick and mortar, regarded La Platière with enthusiastic admiration. She could scarcely find words to express her joy on finding herself possessed of such a secluded, charming retreat as she had often pictured in her dreams. But every cup has its drop of gall. Monsieur Roland's mother and brother still occupied the estate. One, proud, tyrannical, and possessing the enviable characteristics of a shrew. The other, gruff, coarse, and surly, kept discord perpetually awake. The mother's turbulent spirit was soon hushed in the unregretted sleep of death, an event that decided the Roland family to occupy their estate throughout the year. 5 years of undisturbed happiness succeeded. Madame Roland's time was divided between the systematic regulation of domestic duties, the education of their only and idolized child Eudora, and the reception of much company attracted by the scientific celebrity of Monsieur Roland. Beside all these time-consuming demands, she secured 2 hours during the day to pass in her husband's study, assisting him in his literary pursuits, with her ready and popular pen, that gained him many an eulogium. Happy in lending her talents to secure his renown rather than her own, and capable of an entire devotion to his comfort and happiness, more from a sense of duty and veneration than the promptings of love, she passed those 5 years in an uninterrupted tranquillity that seemed a rest to her tired spirit, a preparation, a gathering of strength for the tempestuous life that followed. End of section 39. Recording by Matthew Reese, Davenport, Iowa. Section 40 of the Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Reese. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins. Madame Roland, Part 3. In 1790, the low but fearful rumblings of the political storm that had long been gathering over France boomed through the cities, along the valleys, echoed through the mountain hamlets, and sounded in the ears of those hidden in distant and obscure retreats. Monsieur Roland and his wife, aroused at the welcome tones of the first murmurings of liberty, hastened to Lyons, where the contest had arisen with powerful excitement. Madame Roland's saloons were thrown open, and the most prominent of the revolutionary party gathered there to discuss the principles to be adopted. Madame Roland engaged in their councils, guided their decisions by eloquent and burning words that fell from her lips with irresistible fascination. Her ardor stimulated their zeal. Her impassioned appeals fired them with new and daring efforts to shake off the oppressive yoke of kingly aristocracy. Thus conspicuously arrayed against the royalists, Monsieur Roland's name was upon every lip, with praises on one side and bitter denunciations on the other, a hostility that nerved his wife with a stronger enthusiasm, and absorbed all the powers of her indefatigable mind in the one idea and aim of universal freedom. Louis XVI, irresolute in yielding, attempted to conciliate the stormy populace and to avert the accumulating vengeance of years from his devoted head. But the iniquities of his predecessors and the surrounding nobility were destined to be visited on this monarch, too weak, too undiscerning, to arrest the furious passions he blindly tampered with. To appease the multitude, he convened the National Assembly. This body consisted of the nobility, the higher clergy, and representatives from all parts of the nation. Monsieur Roland, the favorite and leading man of the revolutionary party in the city of Lyons, was elected their representative by a large majority. On the 20th of February, 1791, he repaired to Paris with his wife, who a few years before sat a homeless, obscure maiden in a desolate garret, but now brilliant, wealthy, and influential, was the worshipped heroine of the Republican party. She daily attended the sittings of the Assembly and listened with intense interest to the exciting debates. The refined and courtly bearing, the polished and cultivated language of the Royalists struck her favorably, in contrast with the coarse plebeian manners and illiterate speech of the Democrats. But though her tastes would have inclined her to the former, the latter involved her principles, and contrast only served to increase her ardent wish for the education and refinement of the lower classes. Before the close of the first sitting of the Assembly, the nobility were vanquished, and the royal family were compelled to abandon their palaces at Versailles and remain in Paris. The contest assumed a new phase, being sustained between the Girondists and Jacobins, one party intent upon the preservation of the throne, limited in its power by a free constitution, the other fiercely bent upon the overthrow of the altar, the throne, the distinctions of nobility, and every barrier that prevented the entire equality of all classes. Monsieur Roland and his wife zealously supported the former. The leading and most intelligent of the Girondists assembled 4 evenings in the week at the home of Monsieur Roland, attracted by his integrity and calm, deliberate wisdom, as well as by the more fascinating conversational powers of his brilliant wife, to whose opinions they paid the most sincere and flattering deference. Among those who frequented her saloons was a young lawyer of repulsive appearance, stupid and awkward, possessed of an obstinate temper, utterly devoid of sensitiveness, caring as little for applause as the hisses of contempt with which his long, dry speeches were invariably received in the Assembly. Madame Roland alone discovered genius in the sullen, moody young man. She saw the energy, the rock-like fixedness of purpose, the hatred of luxury and aristocracy that would make him a favorite with the multitude, and feeling him to be a dangerous enemy, yet not a friend to be trusted, she welcomed him to her circle more from policy than choice. He listened entranced to the eloquent voice and clear reasoning of the intrepid Madame Roland, and bowed in awe to her high-souled principles, yet was ready to aim a deadly blow at them, and at her who gave them utterance, when ambition or interest suggested. This was Robespierre. Abbott says of his admiration of that accomplished woman, "He studied Madame Roland with even more of stoical apathy than another man would study a book which he admires. The next day he would give utterance in the Assembly, not only to the sentiments, but even to the very words and phrases which he had carefully garnered from the exuberant diction of his eloquent instructress. Occasionally every eye would be riveted upon him, and every ear attentive, as he gave utterance to some lofty sentiment in impassioned language which had been heard before in sweeter tones from more persuasive lips." On one occasion, in the early part of his career, having laid himself under the displeasure of the multitude, and exposed to accusation from the Assembly, Madame Roland found him a place of security, and pled for him with an influential member of the Assembly, till his defense was promised. Robespierre escaped to become the assassin of his benefactors. In September 1791, the Assembly was dissolved and M. Roland and his wife retired from Paris. The 2 or 3 months of seclusion that succeeded rather inspired them for new efforts than made them forget the perils of France. A new Assembly convened in November, and though the previous members could not be re-elected, M. and Madame Roland determined to return to Paris and share the danger and excitement daily increasing in the metropolis. The most influential and learned men from all parts of the nation gathered there to watch the shaping of events that every moment assumed a more threatening aspect. Clubs were formed to discuss the momentous questions of the times, and every evening various private saloons were the scenes of exciting and intensely interesting debate. The position and influence of the Rolands is thus described. M. Roland was grave, taciturn, oracular. He had no brilliance of talent to excite envy. He displayed no ostentation in dress or equipage or manners to provoke the desire in others to humble him. His reputation for stoical virtue gave a wide sweep to his influence. His very silence invested him with a mysterious wisdom. Consequently, no one feared him as a rival, and he was frequently thrust forward as the unobjectionable head of a party by all who hoped through him to promote their own interests. He was what we call in America an available candidate. Madame Roland, on the contrary, was animated and brilliant. Her genius was universally admired. Her bold suggestions, her shrewd counsel, her lively repartee, her capability of cutting sarcasm, rarely exercised, her deep and impassioned benevolence, her unvarying cheerfulness, the sincerity and enthusiasm of her philanthropy, and the unrivaled brilliance of her conversational powers, made her the center of a system around which the brightest intellects were revolving. Vergniaud, Pétion, Brissot, and others whose names were then comparatively unknown, but whose fame has since resounded through the civilized world, loved to do her homage. With such elements of popularity, it is not surprising that they were elevated to a position in which the prisoner king was obliged to place them to appease the stormy populace. Murders were nightly committed. The terrified nobles were hastily escaping with their families. Confusion and death reigned everywhere. There was no expedient left the monarch but to accede to the demands of the people, dismiss his ministry, and replace it by republican candidates. M. Roland was immediately selected by the Girondists as Minister of the Interior, a post scarcely inferior to the crown itself, and especially elevated at this moment when only the shadow of authority remained with the king. M. Roland and his wife immediately occupied the palace which had been the recipient of Necker but a short time before, and furnished by him with regal splendor. At last the scornful Manon was the mistress of one of those magnificent palaces, was elevated to an equality with kings and princes, and rolled through the thoroughfares of Paris in one of the very gilded coaches that had excited her childish contempt. Madame Roland, however, was in a position that rightly belonged to her, and which she filled with unaffected grace and dignity. She found full scope for her abundant talents, so assiduously cultivated in her youth, an opportunity for the magnanimous exercise of her forgiving and generous temper. On one occasion, after leaving her elegant dining hall, where she had entertained the greatest men in France, she found in the saloon an old man, who, with profound respect, begged an interview with the Minister of the Interior. She discovered in him a haughty aristocrat, who many years before had humiliated her proud spirit by leaving her, on the occasion of a visit, to dine with the menials. She exulted in her own thoughts at the reversed position in which they now stood, but generously restrained any manifestation of her triumph. From all the splendid apartments of the palace, Madame Roland selected a small, retired room, furnished as a library, and where she spent nearly all her time. Here gathered the influential members of the Assembly, discussing the momentous affairs of state, occasionally turning to consult her, while she sat at a little distance at a small work-table, occupied with her needle or pen. Here she wrote the proclamations, the state papers, and the letters which were presented to the king and assembly in M. Roland's name, securing to him the enthusiastic admiration alone due to herself. The Jacobin party were every day increasing in strength, and ready to pour from the cellars and haunts of vice with which Paris was thronged, numberless advocates of their ferocious measures. The king had already been insulted in his palace by the mob. The royalists had fled to Coblentz, and were preparing to march with the Prussian army to reinstate the French monarch, a movement which filled both the Girondists and Jacobins with alarm. Louis, irresolute and vacillating, took no decided measures. He endeavored to conciliate all parties, and thus gain the confidence and support of none. At this crisis, Madame Roland, in behalf of the Girondists and in the name of the minister, addressed a bold and eloquent letter to the king, demanded him to proclaim war against the emigrants, and take instant measures to prevent their meditated attack, in union with the Prussians, upon Paris. By thus cooperating with the Girondists, his crown might be saved, though his power would be limited, while if he opposed them, his downfall and horrible anarchy must ensue. The letter, written with glowing and impassioned eloquence, was given by M. Roland to the king on the 11th of June, 1792. Its proposed decree was too unpalatable to the monarch, the truth which it contained too plain for the royal ear. He commented upon it by peremptorily dismissing M. Roland from office. "Here am I dismissed from office," exclaimed the deposed minister to his wife on entering her library. "Present your letter to the Assembly, that the nation may see for what counsel you have been dismissed," replied the intrepid Madame Roland. The letter was presented. It received unbounded applause from the Assembly, and was ordered to be printed and scattered throughout every department in France. It was a firebrand, thrown among combustibles. The rapturous applause of millions followed the hero to the obscure retreat which Madame Roland selected in a retired street of the metropolis. But here they were sought out, and their apartments thronged with the admiring adherents of both parties. The Girondists, now no longer willing to support the king, openly proposed the establishment of a republic. Danger hourly increased. The populace, incensed at the removal of M. Roland, attacked the Tuileries, insulted the monarch and the royal family, and, in every possible way, vented their rage and hatred. Louis was obliged to consent to the reinstatement of the republican minister, and again M. Roland and his wife occupied the magnificent palace from which they had suddenly been expelled. The arrest and imprisonment of Louis XVI soon after caused M. Roland to send in his resignation to the Assembly, since the office he held was virtually annulled. He could now have escaped with his wife from the frightful scenes daily enacting in the streets of Paris, but her courageous spirit would not recoil from danger or death, so long as a hope remained of rescuing France from threatened anarchy. The rapid approach of the Prussian army terrified all parties. The Jacobins, having obtained the ascendancy of power in Paris, and determined to save themselves from the vengeance of the advancing army, ordered every man in Paris capable of bearing arms to prepare to advance to the frontiers, and repulse the emigrant royalists and their allies. In order to ensure this decree, and to rid themselves of all who were secretly ready to fall upon them when encouraged by the near approach of the army, the gates of Paris were closed, and at night every house in the metropolis was entered by parties of Jacobins, its apartments and most secret recesses searched, victims dragged forth from every possible place of concealment, and horribly murdered. Everyone who gave the slightest suspicion of favoring the royalists were instantly put to death. The innocent and guilty perished together. Homes were deluged with the blood of helpless and innocent victims. Fathers perished with their helpless children. Beautiful women were dragged to the guillotine. The prisons were crowded with trembling victims, who were one after another beheaded in the courtyards, till the pavements ran with blood. Fiends, thirsting for the heart's blood of both friend and foe, prowled through the streets, sheathing their daggers in human flesh at every step. This frightful massacre continued till every royalist had fallen. And now the frenzied Jacobins fixed their bloody fangs upon the Girondists. A fierce struggle for supremacy in the Convention ensued. It was more than a political reaching after power, more than patriotic fervor that inspired the eloquent addresses at the tribune. It was a struggle for life. One party or the other must lay their heads beneath the axe. The Jacobins attempted to strike a deadly blow at the Girondists by bringing an accusation against their inspiring genius, Madame Roland. A spy was employed to ingratiate himself in her confidence, and, by perverting her expressions, obtain her accusation and bring her to the scaffold. She quickly penetrated his designs and scornfully repulsed his friendship. He, however, charged her with carrying on a secret correspondence with exiled royalists, and she was summoned before the tribunal. A vast assemblage awaited the entrance of the woman whose fame had sounded throughout Europe, and whose influence had so strongly wielded the assembly. Everyone was anxious and curious to behold the wonderful being who, retaining a feminine seclusion, yet breathed through manly lips a thrilling patriotism worthy of a Roman orator. At the instant she appeared, a respectful silence pervaded the assemblage. Old men and young, friend and enemy, even Robespierre and Marat, watched with undisguised admiration the majestic bearing, yet womanly loveliness and modesty, with which this noble woman advanced and stood before the bar. Her replies to the President were full of dignity and frankness, uttered in sweet, clear tones that fell with a magical effect upon the listeners. Every answer exposed more clearly the villainy and falsehood of her accuser, and when she tremulously began her own defense, gathering courage as she spoke, till the eloquence and fervor of her exalted spirit was showered in words of fire upon the assembly, there was not an eye but was riveted upon her, not an ear but strove to catch every syllable that fell from her lips. They sat, silent and entranced, and when her voice ceased, shouts of approval rose on every side. She was acquitted both by friend and foe, and even the heartless bloodhound whose life she had saved, and who was soon to drag her to the scaffold, could not withhold a smile of approval and admiration as she glided triumphantly from among them. 4 or 5 months of turmoil, of hatred, of frightful anarchy, heightened the unbridled and murderous passions of the populace. The Jacobins governed the assembly. The mob governed the Jacobins. The deliberations of the convention were guided by the thousands of assassins who, with upheld daggers, crowded the lobbies and surrounded the building in hoarse tumult. The death of Louis XVI was demanded, and in the midst of an exciting scene every Girondist was obliged to ascend the tribune and pronounce death upon the king, or feel the cold steel sliding quickly into his own heart. This submission did not cool the unquenchable hatred of the mob. Conspiracies were repeatedly formed to assassinate the Girondists, at one moment almost beneath the gleaming weapons in the convention, at another roused only in time to bar their doors against creeping demons, waiting the stroke of a certain hour to plunge the deadly knife in their bosoms. Madame Roland, exposed to the execrations of the populace because of her well-known position among the Girondists, was entreated to seek safety. Some devoted friends brought her the dress of a peasant girl, urging her to assume the disguise and fly with her daughter, that her husband might follow her unencumbered. But she spurned to save herself thus. Throwing the dress from her, she exclaimed, "I am ashamed to resort to any such expedient. I will neither disguise myself, nor make any attempt at secret escape. My enemies may find me always in my place. If I am assassinated, it shall be in my own home. I owe my country an example of firmness, and I will give it." At M. Roland's resignation, they had again retired to an obscure dwelling in the Rue de la Harpe. Here, in a solitary room, they still received the agitated supporters of the Republic, in vain attempting to devise measures to stem the overwhelming tide deluging France, and gradually circling into a dizzy whirlpool that was finally to engulf both the assassin and the victim. Each day the circles grew narrower and swifter, and the Girondists, unable to escape from a vortex bearing them on to certain death, could only fortify themselves to meet it heroically. End of section 40. Recording by Matthew Reese, Davenport, Iowa. Section 41 of the Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Reese. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins. Madame Roland, Part 4. On the morning of the 31st of May, 1793, a driving, rolling mist darkened the streets of Paris. Crowds of demoniac men, howling women, and reckless, bloodthirsty boys blocked up the thoroughfares, adding their shouts and imprecations to the dismal tolling of bells, booming cannons, and the melancholy sound of the tocsin. The rush and the roar rolled ominously through the convulsed city. "Il est suprême dies!" "It is our last day!" exclaimed one of the illustrious Girondists. And he said it with truth. Madame Roland and her husband remained in their solitary room, listening in sickening suspense to the sounds borne even to their distant retreat, not daring to venture into the streets, where their appearance would be the sure signal of death. Friends brought them tidings of events during that dreadful day. The clouds that had hung gloomily over the city since morning gathered in an early twilight. Monsieur Roland sat gloomy, unnerved, and despairing, while his courageous wife, whom danger never intimidated, spoke cheerfully and hopefully even in these hours of terror. But her words were suddenly checked by the sound of brutal voices and stumbling, heavy footsteps ascending the dark stairway. In another moment 6 armed men noisily burst into the apartment, and, advancing toward Monsieur Roland, showed him a warrant for his arrest in the name of the Convention. "I do not recognize the authority of your warrant, and shall not voluntarily follow you," said he to the officer. The leader replied that he had no orders to exercise violence, and should return his answer to the council, leaving a guard to secure his person. Far from being overcome with womanly fears, at this near approach of their enemies, Madame Roland was strengthened with fresh heroism. She immediately sat down and rapidly penned a glowing letter to the Convention, ordered a coach, left a friend with her husband, and drove speedily to the Tuileries, where the Assembly was engaged in riotous debate. A dense and murmuring crowd filled the gardens and the courts, rendering access almost impossible. Undaunted, she forced her way through, approached the sentinels who guarded the doors, and asked admission. It was refused. An instant's thought suggested a deception. Assuming the tone of the Jacobins, she assured them that she had important notes for the president that would admit of no delay in times when traitors threatened the restoration of a monarchy. The sentinel immediately permitted her to pass. Another sentinel was stationed at the door of an inner passage. "I wish to see one of the messengers of the house," said she. "Wait till one comes out," was the surly reply. 15 minutes passed that seemed hours to the impatient, anxious wife. At length she descried a messenger to whom she gave the letter, and it was immediately delivered to the president. A long hour passed, yet Madame Roland still stood at the entrance, watching with painful interest every face that came from among the excited assembly, hoping for tidings of her husband's release in reply to her appeal. But no message came, and at length, unable longer to endure suspense, she sent for one of the principal Girondists, and besought him to gain her admission to the bar, that she might speak in defense of her husband and her friends. "The Convention has lost all power. Your words can do no good. Violence, noise, and confusion fill the house," replied Vergniaud. Madame Roland abandoned the hope, and leaving her letter to speak the words she would eloquently have uttered, promised herself to return in 2 hours, and hastily sought her home again to assure herself of her husband's safety. Upon entering her apartments, Monsieur Roland and the guards were nowhere to be seen. Alarmed, she inquired and searched till she found Monsieur Roland had escaped the vigilance of his keepers, and was concealed in the house of a friend. Finding him at last, and inspiring him with new courage as her own revived, she again parted from him and returned to the Tuileries, though the midnight bell had tolled. The streets were brilliantly illuminated, but silent and deserted. The palace and the assembly rooms were vacant. A quiet and gloomy mystery rested upon the place that a few hours before had been crowded with a mass of human beings swaying to and fro with the passions of demons grasping for new victims. Foreboding some new and horrible calamity, she turned from the palace, blazing with lights, and traversed the streets till the shouts and uproar of the maddened voices of a countless multitude reached her ear. A nearer approach revealed the 22 Girondists of the Assembly, guarded and driven before the mob, with threatened violence towards the dungeons of the Conciergerie. Enough. Madame Roland knew at a glance her own fate, and the doom of all she loved. A moment's delay at the Louvre to consult with a friend some means for her husband's escape, and she sped back to her own home, penned a hasty letter to Monsieur Roland, then sat quietly to scan the day's events, and see the extent of her own danger. Bold, heroic, and energetic, she had preserved her cheerfulness and hope to this moment, but the remembrance of her fugitive husband, and a glance at her sleeping child resting innocently and securely upon her mother's pillow, brought with a sharp pang the thought of leaving the idolized Eudora an orphan. Her courage was gone. She threw herself beside the sweet sleeper, threw back the bright ringlets that clustered round the child's rosy face, kissed it with clinging love, and wept such tears as she had never shed before. Exhausted with grief and fatigue, she fell into a deep slumber, with her child closely clasped in her arms. It was a mother's last dear embrace. Just as the dawn of a cheerless, cloudy morning stole through the curtained windows, the rush and tramp of many feet, the clattering of steel weapons and clubs, and the hoarse howlings of a debauched multitude, aroused Madame Roland in time to meet at the door the rough leaders, who immediately announced her arrest. No tears, not a word of supplication escaped her lips. She calmly pressed a farewell kiss upon the lips of her child, committed her to a friend, spoke cheerfully to the weeping servants, and followed the officers with a heroic and defiant dignity that elicited their respect and protection. To secure her from the insults of the mob, one of the officers kindly proposed to close the windows of the carriage. "No," she replied. "Oppressed innocence should not assume the attitude of crime and shame. I do not fear the looks of honest men, and I brave those of my enemies." She calmly and pityingly gazed upon the passionate and distorted countenances of the crowd that pressed about the carriage with threatening words and gestures. They fell back, awed at her fearless bearing, and let her pass unmolested. The iron doors, bolts, and bars of the Abbaye prison closed upon Madame Roland. A bare, comfortless room, dimly lighted by a high, narrow, grated window through which the damp, chilly air crept, was given her in lieu of her own home. Nothing broke the cheerless aspect of this gloomy cell. A straw pallet lay in one corner close to the cold, mouldy walls, but without uttering a word of complaint, the undaunted prisoner laid herself down upon the humble couch, and fell into a deep, dreamless slumber. But a few days passed before the jailer and his kind-hearted wife were fascinated with the cheerful cordiality, the winning, gentle manners, and heroic endurance of the new prisoner. They willingly aided her in giving the cell an air of taste and comfort. At first a little table appeared, and another day the jailer's wife came in smiling and full of mystery with something concealed under her wide apron. Suddenly the table was decorated and brightened with a neat white spread, and the good little woman hastened away, pleased and proud with Madame Roland's rewarding expressions of surprise and pleasure. Then came books, writing materials quickly followed, and lastly fresh, beautiful flowers bloomed in the grated window of her cell. 4 months passed away, and the beginning of the 5th found Madame Roland cheerful and contented, strong and resolute as when she graced the elegant saloons of a palace home. Satisfied and happy that her husband had escaped, at rest in regard to her child, safely asylumd with a friend, and hoping for the near approach of the nation's tranquillity and her consequent release, she lost not a moment in repinings or useless tears. Occupied with her books, or sketching the scenery of La Platière, and other places distinct and dear in remembrance, or writing her memoirs, she scarcely lived at all in the damp, dark cell. Her busy imagination was continually on the wing, and when recalled to her loneliness and imprisonment by the entrance of the keeper with her coarse fare, she felt no gloom, shed no tears, but kindly greeted him and partook of the untempting food, spread upon a rusty stove to preserve the little table unsoiled, with as much liveliness and grace as if she presided at the splendid dining table of the Minister of the Interior. She might have possessed herself of some luxuries, but choosing rather to relieve her fellow sufferers, she distributed her money among them, to obtain necessary comforts. One day 2 commissioners entered her cell to extort from her, if possible, the secret of her husband's retreat, since all Paris and its environs had been diligently searched for the fugitive minister. She scorned to dissimulate, and told them plainly she knew the place of his concealment, but nothing on earth could induce her to betray him. She spurned them from her. From first to last, Madame Roland's defiant heroism cost her liberty and life. Her contemptuous treatment of these Jacobin inquisitors determined her fate. She was too illustrious, too eloquent, too fearless a woman to be suffered to live, but it was necessary to convict her on a new charge in order to bring her to the scaffold. The following day an officer entered and announced to Madame Roland that her liberty was restored. Scarcely believing her senses, she emerged from her prison, joyfully breathed the free air again, and accustomed her eyes to the blinding light of day, scarcely less bewildering than the exultation of being free, of clasping her child to her heart and claiming her own home. Ordering a carriage to drive quickly to the Rue de la Harpe, it was not long before she alighted at her own door, her face beaming with the expected happiness of hearing again the voice of Eudora. She eagerly bounded up the steps and opened the door. Her foot was upon the threshold, when 2 men darted from places of concealment, seized and rudely thrust her back into the carriage, with the assurance that the Assembly had issued a new warrant for her arrest. They bore her to the prison of Sainte Pelagie, and conducted her to a loathsome dungeon already crowded with the most abandoned women and desperate villains, whose repulsive aspect made her shudder and shrink from the vile contact. Her courage no longer supported her. The disappointment had been too cruel. She sat down amidst the miserable wretches of the dungeon, and wept and sobbed with uncontrollable sorrow. But here, as in the other prison, she gained the sympathy of her keepers, who soon ventured to remove her to a narrow cell by herself. As before, her room gradually assumed an unexpected degree of comfort. Books, music, drawing, and writing were made available by the kindness of Madame Beauchot, the wife of the jailer. Flowers and vines twisted among and hid the ugly iron bars across the high window, and a small table and comfortable bed completed all her wants. Once more she gathered calmness and happiness from her employments. She could utter with triumph what Marie Antoinette exclaimed in despair: "What a resource amid the calamities of life is a highly cultivated mind." On the same day when the Girondists were executed, October 31st, 1793, Madame Roland was led to the dungeons of the Conciergerie. This frightful prison lay beneath the Palace of Justice. A wide flight of stone steps led down to the subterraneous passages that wound and twisted and intersected each other like caged serpents, and terminated in cells, cold, dark, and silent as the grave. The atmosphere was humid and noxious. Moisture oozed from the walls, and the damp, slippery floors made the bewildered captive recoil from a footing that suggested a path among sliding lizards and creeping scorpions. Through these dark labyrinths the heroic Girondists and the hapless queen had passed forth to a repulsive bloody death. Ladies distinguished for beauty and talent, young girls fair and innocent, noble men and their aged fathers, bowed and trembling under the snowy crown of years, had gone forth daily to appease the mad multitude thirsting for human blood. Still agonizing groans resounded through the gloomy corridors, or sometimes echoed to a wailing death song from the breaking heart of some despairing prisoner. Rarely the voice of prayer went up from these cells, except wrested from some frantic victim. Those were days of infidelity. God had withdrawn his presence from the atheistical nation. From one of those cells came a sweet voice that uttered eloquent and inspiring words in clear, ringing tones, thrilling every listener and kindling a new heroism from the ashes of despair. Those lips did not beguile fellow captives to exhausting, enervating tears, but aroused all the patriotic fire, the exalted courage, and the stoicism of which they were capable. They caught the unshrinking lofty tone of the bold-spirited orator, and when she paced the narrow courts, gathered round her with a love and devotion they might have paid to an angel. Fascinating and graceful, even in prison robes, stately and commanding, yet womanly and gentle, the sturdiest bowed before her, and the weakest leaned upon the strength her impassioned soul could impart. But one day she smilingly glided past them, attired in flowing white drapery, and her dark hair falling in wavy abundance to her girdled waist. She hastened cheerfully along the winding passages, passed through the massive entrances, and soon stood in the hall of the Palace of Justice, before an excited and tumultuous throng. In vain her voice richly and eloquently rose above the confused murmurings boldly speaking her own defense. Not in crouching supplication, not in fear of death, not in appeals to the humanity and sympathy of the assembly, but in daring defiance of their imputing a single crime to her or to those illustrious men who had gone before her to the scaffold. She sealed her own doom while proudly asserting her innocence. She was condemned to die. Fully prepared for this sentence, she received it with unchanging countenance, and returned to her cell as cheerfully as she had emerged from it, intimating her fate to the prisoners as she passed them, by silently drawing a finger across her white throat. That night an old harp that had long lain untouched in the solitary cell resounded with slow, mournful tones, accompanied by a full, melodious voice, sadly sweeping a wild requiem through the long galleries that had been silent to every sound but human groans or shouts of exultation or despair. The shuddering captives recognized the farewell. The following morning, the gloomy opening of a November day, a long line of carts, crowded with victims for the guillotine, issued from the yard of the Conciergerie. In the last was the white-robed heroine of the dungeons, still calm and self-possessed, still bearing up the drooping spirits of those who stood beside her. An old man with whitened locks, weak and trembling, leaned upon her sustaining arm. Her own face was brilliant and blooming, freshened and tinged with the cool morning air. The near approach of a sudden and horrible death was no intimidation to her heroic spirit. Nearer and nearer the rough vehicle approached the scaffold, as those in advance were emptied. Higher and more ghastly grew the heaps of the slain. Faster and fuller rolled the crimson tide. At last came the cart with the old man and the beautiful, fearless woman. She was still brave and undaunted, he shrinking and pale with terror. "Go first," said she, "that you may not witness my death." But the brutal executioner commanded her to ascend first. "You will not refuse a woman's last request," she replied mildly, and with one of her winning smiles. The murder-inured man was one like everyone else upon whom that fascinating smile fell. The old man with the whitened locks bowed his head first beneath the axe. Then came the noble woman with firm, unfaltering step. She knelt. An instant of awful stillness was succeeded by the terrible sound of the sliding axe, and the beautiful head, enveloped in its dark veil of flowing ringlets, fell from the block. The noble, heroic, exalted spirit of Madame Roland had gone to the eternity she had so often and so darkly questioned. Her soul was, in an instant, ushered to the presence of an unacknowledged God, before whose tribunal human philosophy and stoicism and lofty endurance must vanish into nothingness. End of section 41. Recording by Matthew Reese, Davenport, Iowa. End of The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins.